So this course is a case study. I tested an application, it was tracks, and I made a bunch of notes and I tracked what I did and I did debriefs as I was testing. So I've recorded all the videos for those and they will be injected in the course. You will also see sections like this which are essentially theory, which are slide based, and I'm going to talk about the aspects that I was working on. Because what I've done is I've taken an application, tested it to try and demonstrate how to test it in practice. So I'm not covering all the theory of testing, right? Because with each application, we will only ever use subsets of our knowledge. But in practical terms, if I look at a single application and a single feature, I can go into real detail on what I actually did and why I did it. And hopefully that will come through. Now, what I've done as a result of this is I've modeled the basic process that I used and the basic, sessions that I've used when I was doing testing, and I've put them here. So you'll see this diagram as we go through. This diagram is not meant to be a full scope of what we do when we're testing, right? But it's what I did when I tested this particular application. In any part of your applications, when you're testing it, you may have other sessions that you use. I have generic sessions in here, like the exploratory session is very generic. I can do anything in there. The admin section is basically, if there's something I did that I haven't covered, I'll throw it in the admin section. So that could easily be spun out. But I wanted to try and simplify the important aspects of what I was doing: planning, setting things up, checking things are working, doing some recon and modeling, and the difference between a coverage session and an exploratory session, the difference between an exploratory session and a technical session, debrief. These are really important aspects, and admin is really important, but it covers a whole bunch of processes. So when you see this, this isn't saying this is what you do. This is saying this is a high-level diagrammatic representation of what I think I did when I was testing. And I didn't necessarily do it in this order, although it came close. So you would mix and match the different aspects. Even though it's showing it as a flow model, it's looping around. We do different things at different times. I just haven't put all the connections and relationships in there. So you'll see that as we go through. Now this is a micro case study. So essentially, I performed about a day of testing. So 4 hours of hands-on testing that was pretty intense, and then I debriefed that, then I tidied up my notes, then I thought about it, then I figured out what I was going to do next. So all those extra bits are kind of equivalent to the admin processes we would do that would take up probably like a full 8-hour day, but we never have full 8-hour days at work. So this is about a day and a half of actual testing wrapped into this. Then what I'm doing is I'm looking at what I did at a micro level and extrapolating it up to what can I learn in general about testing at a macro level. That's what this means. And so it means not everything that I've did will be discussed, not all testing will be discussed, we won't look at all testing techniques, but everything that I'm talking about has some context. So there's quite a few lectures in here. There should be slides available and the PDF for my notes, and we'll see what else we put in here, but hopefully there's enough in there to give you an understanding of how I approached testing. And do ask questions as you go through, leave comments, because then I may be able to answer by text or possibly create another lectures, but it's useful to know how much of my test process and thought process actually gets communicated through this. So this micro course is a spin-off of a talk that I'm going to do. And I'm going to do this talk twice. It's an unusual thing. I'm going to do this talk at an online conference in December and a conference in America in April 2020. Don't normally repeat talks, but I'm trying to make my life a little bit easier. And as part of that, I'm also going to record it as a micro course for Patreon. Now, the intent for this is I get asked, how do I test? How do I know what to do? What tools do I use? What is the thought process, etc., etc. And that's this course. So, but I don't want to work in theory. So in order to work as a practical exercise, I'm actually going to think through from start to finish, and these are going to be short sessions. So finish is a fairly arbitrary term. How I go about testing a web application. And this is a kind of micro example. So what I'm going to do is, once I've done a test session, I'm going to go macro to that and see what lessons learned that apply across the board to other sessions. So I'm going to use the Tracks API. Okay, so this might seem a little bit of an odd section, choosing the right person for the job, right? Because I am testing this on my own. But what I'm really talking about is the notion that I had to choose which application I was going to test. And I did that based on my technical knowledge, my understanding of the web, my understanding of open source applications, my knowledge. So I'm choosing the right application for me, but in the real world, this translates into choosing the right person for the job. So I've chosen Tracks, not because I've used it before, although I have. So my familiarity with it before means that I know that it's a web app. It's got a lot of JavaScript. It has an API. It has a database. There's a lot of scope for testing. There's a lot of richness in there. So Tracks is an open source to-do management system where you create actions, next actions. You put them into context, i.e. where are you going to do them, and you can create projects for them, and you can set up reminders, and it's a to-do app based on Dave Allen's getting things done methodology. But ignoring the domain, it's a very useful open source app that I think is very easy to install because I can download a virtual machine or Docker and use it that way. So I'm using Tracks, and I have used it before, but it's been so long since I used it, and previously I've looked at different parts in the application, so every time we approach an application, we'll learn something different. Going macro to this, like most of the time we don't get to choose what we test because we'll be working in environments, we're working in companies, there'll be a manager, the manager will choose what we work on, but the thing is we influence that because we have skills and experience, and some of our skills and experience and domain knowledge will not translate into some applications, so we will not be suitable people to test that without additional training or without offering a risk essentially to the project because we may not know what we're doing. If I have to test a Hadoop app, I really need to work on a team that really understands Hadoop because I will be learning that from scratch. So I've done consultancy on Hadoop teams, but I was relying on their massive amounts of technical knowledge, me reading around the subject, conducting experiments from me asking them questions when they didn't know the answer so we could deep dive into it, me applying my technical testing domain knowledge onto their project and mixing it that way. So we have to combine the right people at the right time to have the right team mix. This can be hard when you're in management. Any of you that are in management will know that this can be hard because someone that you need on a project may not be available because they're on another project and you're trying to juggle things around and projects get delayed and put people off. So that means we have to have some slack in our teams, or we as managers have to have the ability to support people or know that they'll be supported on the team. And sometimes we allocate people to teams because of their soft skills, their personality, and how they will fit into that team. But it is a key lesson that we have to choose the right people for the right technology, for the right job. Otherwise there's a risk. Otherwise there's a process that means we have to manage it to make sure that they understand what they were doing. So that is a tiny lesson, but it's massive. I mean, it's essentially what is test management? Choosing the right person for the job. What is our career management? Making sure we have the skills we need for the job. This is absolutely key to what we do, but at a micro level, it's choosing a particular application to test. So environments is a big concept. And in terms of this model, it's planning and the environment install and set up and getting everything working. Now for Tracks, I could use Docker. There's a lot of Docker images out there for tracks. It's very easy to install a Docker image once you know what you're doing and experiment with them to see which one works. I could do a local install. Tracks is a Ruby on Rails application. I think it's a bit hard to install locally, so I try to avoid that. But if someone was familiar with Ruby on Rails, had the environment set up, a local install might be best for them. I tend to use a virtual machine, which is pre-built, may not be the most up-to-date version, which could be a risk. And the same virtual machine can also be cloud hosted. So I have a lot of options in the environment that I choose. Now, from a testing perspective, I have requirements from that environment. Right, to support my testing, I'm pretty sure I'm going to want to proxy traffic. So it needs to be somewhere that I can proxy traffic. So it doesn't really matter what environment that is, I should be able to do that. But some corporate environments make that really hard, that make that difficult. I may want to view the database, which would limit me so that I don't use Docker, right? Because I don't know Docker well enough to know how to configure a Docker image or running Docker container to allow me to access the database. I don't know how to do that. I'd have to do research. That might take more time. And I'm trying to not necessarily learn how Docker and other environments work as this exercise. I'm trying to learn how my testing works. So I didn't want to impose those extra constraints. I wanted a low impact on my machine, which ruled out a local install. And the knowledge that we have will limit the effectiveness that we have when we're working with an environment. That's why we have to work in teams. That's why it's really important that we don't just get an environment given to us, that we don't have the permissions to it, right? The environment really, really impacts testing. The amount of times I've gone on site and I've worked on projects where we do not have permissions to access the environment. We don't have permissions to SSH into the box to see the logs. That means we can't track the memory usage. There's a whole bunch of things we can't do if we don't have permissions. Sometimes we have too many, not necessarily permissions, but responsibility. So we are responsible for releasing the application into live. It's the same as if I had to install tracks on my local machine. That would be an issue. I may not know how to do that, and I may not have support if I do it myself. Hopefully on Teams we have support, but very often we don't. We're left to get on with it. It can take months sometimes to set up environments for certain test teams. I've seen projects where they have literally spent months setting it up to get it in the right state, and they can't change it once it's there because they don't know how to do backups. It's a completely different install process than live, which itself is essentially a risk for the project, because if you're deploying something differently in the different environments, how do you know that your deployment process hasn't changed things? We really want the same deployment process as live. We really want the same version management. We really want the same level of observation, tracking, monitoring on these testing environments. We want the same process for doing upgrades, downgrades, making sure the database is okay, making sure the same version of the database software is being used on the different environments. Environments are a massive thing. I mean, one of the interesting things with Docker is it makes environment provision a lot easier. And once we understand it, then we can do a lot with it. But it's only really a particularly good thing if we're also using Docker in live. If we suddenly use a different process in live, we have to do some sort of process to mitigate the risk that the live environment might operate differently from the Docker environments that we've been using, and we need to try and, as a project, mitigate that. One of the ways we can do that is by repeating the automated execution on our live environments, but then we have to tear down data, so we might have a subset. But there's that notion that environments impact testing, and when we are not looking at those properly, there's a risk. I mean, this is a constant source of risk. When I'm looking at projects, when I'm doing consultancy, the environments that people use is really, really important, and people underestimate it. So that was an important lesson to come across early in my particular process. And what's interesting for me is the very first session that I have to do is an install session, right? If I was on a project, there'd be lots of discussion, etc., etc. But for me, I'm not working on a project, but I can't do anything until I have an environment, until I have an application installed that I can work. So for me, the first session is an install session. And for tracks, there's multiple ways that I can install tracks. So I could go off to the Trax website, download it and install it and run it locally. To do that, I need to have, so I think it's Ruby on Rails. I need to set up an environment to do that. Given the time scales that I've got, I don't really want to do that. Given the risk that might pose to my main machine, I don't really want to do that. So I want to try and isolate it somewhat. There are Docker instances that I can use to install this. There's at least 3 that I know of if I go off to Docker. So there's a bunch of Trax installs on Docker. If I do Trax, there's a few in here. The one that I mainly use is the Stano one. But I'm not going to use the Docker install for this because my Docker knowledge isn't particularly good. So the technology, the environment would impact my testing. And I want to give myself as many opportunities as possible for exploring the thought processes behind testing. So I want to make my environment as flexible as humanly possible, which is why I'm going to use a virtual machine. I'm going to download the Trax virtual machine from Turkey Linux, Turnkey Linux, not Turkey, it's not, well, it is Thanksgiving at the moment, but it's not Turkey Linux, it's Turnkey Linux. So I'm just going to install a VM and run that using Oracle VM VirtualBox. That's open source, that's free, it allows other people to repeat this if they want. And then Trax runs quite happily in a VM and I can use it. The benefit of that is it's just another machine. I can SSH into it, I can access the database there, I can proxy requests to it quite easily without any issues. There's a specific IP address, everything becomes a little easier. It's basically, I've got Trax installed on another machine in my environment and connecting it to it there, and I can give myself whatever permissions I want. This comes with some constraints because this version of Trax is not the most up to date. For the purposes of my exercise, I don't mind that. Right, so the first session I have is an install session to download it, set it up, go through the process. I've gone through the process, I've set up an admin user on here, just going through all the prompts, and now Trax is running. If I go back to the main, I do not want to quit. If I go back to the main virtual machine configuration, this is what it looks like in the running box. And if I look at the networking tab, then I can see the IP address it's running on, because every time I start up the virtual box, it could be on a different IP address. Currently it's on 192.168.136. It's captured. There we go. So if I go off to 192.168.1.36, I'll see Trax and I'm logged in. And this is the application I'm going to test. So the very first session is simply an install session. It took me half an hour to get it installed. I'm using the virtual machine. I'm running in VirtualBox. And the basic lesson learned from this is the environments that we choose impact our testing. Right, because I need to understand the technology that this is running with. If I don't, I'm going to be limited to the extent that I understand the environment, to the extent that I can access the stack. If I don't understand the environment, if this is running on some really odd new technology, I have no idea what it is, my testing is going to be limited to the front end. I'm going to be limiting my testing because of the environment, because of my access to the environment. Sometimes we have issues that we don't have access to environments, we don't have permissions. And I essentially need permissions to observe. So I can observe traffic without anyone's permission, but I probably want to observe logs. I may want to observe memory overhead on the server. I can only do that if I have the permissions. I may want to interrogate what is happening in those logs longer term. I can only do that if I have permissions. I may want to go into the database. I can only do that if I have permissions. So the environment is really important. It's really key to testing. Our understanding of the environment and the permissions that we have on that environment. So we kind of mentioned this in the environment section, releases and deployments. We really want the same process as live, and we want to share the knowledge. Like too many times I see projects where the programmers are doing all the environment management, which means the test team never learn which means that they never have the ability to go deeper into the logs or the environment to do testing, so they're limited by that knowledge. And it's a very simple thing to pair on projects to share the knowledge, but a lot of people don't do that for some reason. But for me, I had to install the application. So this is where you'll start to see me making notes. This is the first of my notes in the testing. And these are my actual notes. I'll try and show you as much as possible the actual notes that I made, but you'll also see those in the debrief sections. So you can see exactly when I started. I tend to do dates completely backwards, because then I can, if I need to, I can sort files based on the date. So I get used to writing the dates backwards. I think it's readable like that. I don't even have to think when I'm doing it. So I've made a note of where I downloaded the Tracks VM from. I just installed it, which is simple. I've made a note of the IP address that it started on and the admin password that I've got. And you can see I've got timestamps for when I started and when I stopped. Didn't make a lot of notes in this because I know how to do this, right? So the notes are there to support me doing debriefs. They're there to help other people. I think this is fairly obvious what I did when I was working through it. Had anything gone wrong, then I would probably have made more notes. Had I had to do anything different that was not the way that I normally configure virtual machines, I would have made a note, because then that would remind me later on. But this is basically telling me nothing untoward happened, and it took me half an hour to set up Tracks. So then the question is, okay, so I've got my environment. I've installed it as VM, I can log in as admin, but is the actual Tracks ready? Right now, I don't know that. Right, I can get Tracks up, I can go to it, I can kind of click around, I can maybe do I don't really know whether I've installed it properly. This is a big issue on a lot of projects. So I know that I'm going to need to do a kind of health check session to do this. And I've tried to be really careful when I do the sessions here, so that I don't bleed sessions into each other, to try and chunk as much as possible. What is the overriding concept I'm doing at this point in time? So I'm trying to install the application. I could bleed it into going, okay, has it installed correctly and is it ready to test? But really what I did is I got it up and running, I logged in as an admin and then stopped because I had installed. I want to be very clear in my aims because it's too easy to let test sessions bleed into each other. Now, with this particular system, there is no dashboard in Tracks that tells me it's working, that all the services is working, that the database is up and running. I've got no way of seeing the logs from within Tracks. I can't click on a link and it opens the logs up. I can't go to a single dashboard where there's a whole bunch of green lights. So it's not easy for me to ping. I mean, I could ping this and see that I get a response. I could curl, make sure the admin page comes up and put that into a grep and do some checks. I could do some very basic DevOps type scripting checks in there. And sometimes those might be all you need for a particular setup. And I've seen companies where they deploy the application and all they do is ping it to make sure it's working. I don't think that's enough, but that's what sometimes people do. I think it's really important to build dashboards or health checks into our application to make sure it's working and comes back with status codes. Even in some of the REST APIs I build for support and testing, there's usually a am I running, which responds with a yes with a message. So it's not just a ping, I'm actually calling the API to make sure it can trigger something on the back end to make sure the application is started up. Because sometimes you can ping something, it seems like it's there because the port is taken up, but it doesn't actually respond with the correct information because it may not be running. And if you've got a microservice type architecture with multiple services, you really want to make sure they're all working. So this is where automated execution really can help. Right, because we can do automated execution to go through the GUI, make sure things are as expected in the right places, to make API calls, to make sure we're getting the information back. And we might go through a simple CRUD check where we create an entity, read it, do an update, then delete it to make sure the application state is not changed with our health checking. Creating dashboards that self-report can be useful, because what we want to avoid is the issue that we start testing and we do days, weeks, potentially months of testing, which used to happen. And we discover that there's something wrong in the environment, that the wrong version has been deployed, that one microservice that it's relying on isn't quite the same as everything else. So, and if that invalidates testing, we waste a lot of time. So we're trying to de-risk the notion that we might do stuff and find out too late, and we really want to avoid wasting time. So I need to do a health check session in order to check whether that's working. So I split the environment setup and install from the health check to make it really discrete. So I created a health check session. Now this can be useful in multiple different places, like just a quick session to double check that things are as we want before we dive in. We can do that with, are we working with the correct version? Are we doing this? Sometimes it's only 5 minutes. Sessions don't have to be an hour long, half an hour long. Create an aim, do your testing in chunks, we call that a session, and stick to as much as possible what you're trying to do in there. And that's what the health check session that I did was. So my health check is basically just going to be, okay, I'm going to do a create, read, update, delete in the main areas. Keep it simple. I'll try and create a to-do, read it, check that it's there, update it, delete it, make sure I can go through the basic process. And I created notes as I did that, so you can look in the PDF. And it's not a lot of notes. It's not a big session. What was that? 2 o'clock we started and then went through. Yeah, so I started at 2, went through until 20 past. And you can see I stuck fairly well to my plan. So I did a create, read, update, delete. But also I made notes as I was going through. It's almost impossible not to observe as you're doing any kind of activity. So I'm observing as I go through. What happens when I'm doing a very simple high level session is I don't tend to do a lot of interrogation. I don't tend to do a lot of manipulation. So what I'll do is I'll do observation and note down anything that I may want to investigate in the future. Try to avoid going deeper into that and doing an interrogation or manipulation on it to really investigate it, because I'll create another session for that. And I didn't really do that, I think, in this particular session. So there's in this particular set of tests, so there's no session type in there for defect investigation or an investigative exploratory session, right? Because that didn't really come up in the timescales, which is why I'm saying that the model you see at the start of each session is not complete. But it's a very, very simple way. And these are the actual notes I made, right? So these are relatively detailed, and they say what I'm going to do. They say roughly what happened, and I'll make more notes if I really need to be more clear. Sometimes I'm very formal, and I'll have like question in uppercase. Sometimes it will be defect. Sometimes I'll write note. Sometimes I don't really care about the language, so I don't really care about consistency. But over time, I tend to just write note, question, issue, defect, investigate, to do, right? So, and they stand out, so I'm putting them in uppercase. Now, I made my notes in Evernote, which sometimes is a good thing, sometimes it isn't. The reason I did that is because it allows me to embed screenshots easily when I'm doing screen capture. But the notes that you'll see are Markdown, right? So the PDF that I've released, I converted this into Markdown because this is mostly Markdown, right? What you can see there is that some of the outlines are not Markdown, which meant when I copy and pasted them into the text editor, I had to re-indent them to get that working. But I tend to write in text. I tend to write very textual notes that are linear. They go from start to end, and I'll rely on debriefs and other admin sessions to tidy them up and format them. So this is the kind of thing that I observed as I was working, right? I found the delete quite hard to click on, depending on how you move to it. So that would be something that I would probably raise in an admin session afterwards, a communication session. I also found that when I was dragging stuff, there were a lot of rendering type issues. The Z ordering wasn't quite correct at different points. Because I'm moving the mouse, the drop down appears. So again, these are things that I would probably raise in discussion. It doesn't matter that much. But the point for this was, as I was doing this, I realized very quickly that I needed to have a screenshot tool to hand when I'm doing my testing, because there's a lot of visual things that I would see in passing, and I needed to try and capture them as I went through. going macro, everything that we do, every session that we do, every questioning, every grooming of stories, these are all exploratory sessions. They're all observation. We observe the people that we're working with. Do they really understand what they're talking about, or are they trying to bluff us in a story? That's really important when we're working with product owners. Do they really understand what the customer means, or are they bluffing because they just want to get ahead, and then they'll rely on testers or developers later on asking more questions that will flush things out? The whole notion of story grooming is an exploratory process. We have to ask questions as we go through. Now, the exploration that we do when we're working boosts our technical knowledge of the app, because we see things happening and we go, how is it doing that? Is that CSS? Is that JavaScript? I don't know. But it's also constrained by our technical knowledge. This is why we want the right people testing the right app. This is why we want to work on our skills as we're testing, to make sure we understand the technologies that we're working with. For instance, with tracks, I have no idea whether this is using a JavaScript framework or not. I don't think it is. I think it's all custom handwritten JavaScript. But if I was working on the team, I would know that. If I did more investigation into tracks, I would know that. And if I knew it was a JavaScript framework, then there'd be risks associated with that. And there'd also be things I wouldn't test as much because they're part of the framework. If I know it's completely custom, then I'm going to test it in more detail because there's more risk. Now, in terms of time box testing, this is an interesting thing, because some people like force sessions to be an hour or half an hour. With some sessions, it's really important to time box them. If you have an exploratory session and you have a really relatively large charter that you're going to work through, a relatively large set of aims, then you want to time box it so you don't spend too long. Some of my sessions here are very small. I'm quite happy to create small sessions, small tasks and activities, which may not be time boxed. They may just be tracked. So here you can see that I'm tracking the time. I'm not necessarily time boxing them. So don't feel that you have to pursue a session-based time management approach all the time. What you have to do is take ownership of your testing and do what is right for your testing. Splitting it up into small chunks can be really useful. I would previously on some projects create tasks, put them in Jira to make things visible, do my testing in very small chunks, take my testing notes, copy them into that task, again to make it visible, do a debrief session, then summarize it, then put those notes on the higher level story rather than the tasks, my summary notes. But it varies depending on project to project, tool to tool, and what communication we want to do. But it was obvious to me that I needed a screenshot tool. I tend to use Snagit, and I have a tool called Cloud App. All these animated GIFs you're seeing here, I created using Cloud App. But most operating systems have built-in tools. I'm just so used to using Snagit and other tools that I just install those. You don't have to pay for them. Snagit isn't expensive, but use whatever is appropriate. But you do need to have the tools. But I didn't start with a screenshot tool ready. I mean, it's always running, but I didn't start thinking, right, I need to make sure my screenshot tool is there. But it became apparent as I was exploring very early on that I'm going to need certain types of tools to help me. Now, my note taking is I need to write down what my aim is. So in the notes that you saw, you didn't see an aim section. You didn't see me write down, I'm going to do a CRUD section. But that's because I was kind of making notes in the slides, and I'd put my CRUD Healthcheck in there as a slide before I went and did the testing. So I did have those notes in there. It's just they weren't in my testing notes. They were in my kind of high level plan, which was the slides. So we do make notes prior to doing things, and we're writing down our aims or our charters or whatever else we want to call it. I tend to think in terms of aims or objectives. I tend to communicate in terms of charters and sessions because that's how people talk. But in my head, it's much more basic. It's much more time management oriented, and it's what are my aims, what are my objectives, what do I want to achieve, what do I want to investigate, what am I trying to do, and that's my plan. And what's more important is making notes during the testing. Right, this is what differentiates us doing exploratory testing from scripted testing. Scripted testing is making a really detailed plan, right? And the plan goes down to the step-by-step level, what you will do, what you will change, which means that when we actually do our testing, we end up having to maintain our plan because our plan is wrong. So we need to get the script right as we're testing. With exploratory processes, we come up with high-level aims and objectives. We go down to the level of detail that we need to in order to be clear about what we're doing and to communicate it and to help people understand what's going on, to prioritize. But it's really important that we make more notes during the actual testing. Now, I think it's really important to make those notes when we're doing scripted testing as well, but very often the tooling that is in use doesn't support that. It has like an actual column where you just type in what happened, what actually happened, and very often people just put in a tick or they go, as expected, and they don't write down the actual notes. They don't write down the data they did. They don't write down the adjustments. But with exploratory testing, it is key that we gather evidence as we are testing and we make a lot of notes during the testing. I can't stress that enough. This is why I spend a lot of time improving my note taking and doing exercises like this where I try and improve what I'm doing. Make notes that are actually reflective of what you're doing and can stand up as evidence and can support you reviewing it later on. Okay, so the next thing I have to do, I've done my install session, the application is running. Does that mean that I'm actually ready to start testing now? And the answer is, well, no, not really, because I don't really know whether the application has properly installed. I don't know if it's set up. One of the issues we have when we're testing applications is, did the install work? One of the risks we have when we do testing is, if I start testing now and days from now discover that there was an issue with the install of this application in the environment, does that invalidate my testing? I might be investigating problems that are not there. So we have to have some mechanism for telling us whether, even though we've installed it, the application is good enough. Now, hopefully, we're using the same release processes into the test environment that we're using in live. If we, in our software processes, have different release processes throughout the life cycle, we're creating a problem for ourselves. We're creating a risk that may bite us later on. In this instance, I could simply just trust that the virtual machine has been set up correctly and is working correctly, but I don't really want to do that. So what I have to do is I have to do a kind of health check to make sure that works, a health check session. And if this was a real world system, I would be expecting some form of automated execution to help with that, because that can really de-risk deployment and start up the environment. We automate the deployment, we automate the creation of the environment, we automate the startup, we run some checks against that environment to make sure it's running. We ping the machine, we have something that comes in and goes to the homepage, we have something that logs in, makes sure we can log in, maybe double checks the database, make sure all the tables are there, does some checksums on whatever we want. Make sure it's in the right folders, make sure that there's log files being written, it has access to the log files. All those kind of health checks. It's great when an application itself has its own dashboard and everything goes green internally. At the old arcade machines, when they were switched on, they would go through a self-check validation process. That really, really helps when you're working with systems, because you can automate the dashboard, the internal dashboard, show all green. Is that status working? So the more that we can have the application self-check, the better. Otherwise, we have to come in and check it ourselves. Now, I don't have any automated checks on this, so I'm going to have to do a health check session. Now, I've done my health check session, so I'm just going to quickly show you the notes, and then I'm going to partially repeat this so you see what's going on. What I didn't want to do in this course is show the exact testing process, because that can be a little bit boring. Now, these are the actual notes I made when I did my health check session. So you can see that I ran through a basic CRUD process, right? That's why I really wanted to make sure that the application could create entities, I could read them, I could update them, I could delete them. If I could do those basic things, I was fairly happy that it was going to work. So I used the front page, which you can see here, to create some actions. And I almost couldn't help myself because I don't know this application. I'm learning at the same time. So it wasn't completely a health check. I had to make up what my health check was. I have no idea what a health check for this application is. So I actually made it up as I was going along. So I tried, I'll create an action. So I'll just add an action. Then I can see that the description can't be blank. But I saw that the form didn't refresh the page. So there must be some XHR messages, some XHTTP messages going on that I can't see, which hints to me that I'm going to need more tooling later on to observe the messages. If I don't know what the rules are for this, so I'm going to add something with a description. I'll add A, and it's added it. So I now have something with an A. And that worked this time because there was a context. By default, it's putting in one of the contexts, which is there. So if I do it with just the description, then I'm getting told the context can't be blank. So I'm learning the validation rules during this health check because I don't know how this application works. I can read the data by jumping between the tabs and seeing that data appears in those different tabs. So I'm doing that. That's fine. I can amend these things. So I created A. How can I amend this? I can amend this by clicking here and amending it in situ. I've got the ability to create notes. Let's change that. And it amends there. And again, actions saved here. So there's XHR messages being sent that I'm not covering in my testing at this point, but I need to at some point in the future. How do I delete these? So there's a drop down here and I can delete or defer them. Now, I'm looking at this and I'm seeing risk, right? This is clearly there's some JavaScript in here. This might be CSS styling on hover. I suspect it's not, but I don't know. So there's something I have to investigate there. There's potential risk in there, but I can delete. Let me just delete this. And that's interesting. So we've got an alert. So we've got JavaScript in there. This is still here. It hasn't gone away, which makes me think it's JavaScript rather than CSS. Okay. Then it's gone. XHR message. What if the messages are not getting through? There's test ideas coming into my head as I'm testing, even though I'm doing the health check. Now, what I see that's interesting here is this moving thing. So I can move these around and stuff happens, which is interesting. But also look at that. When I move this, and I don't know if that's because the mouse is getting close to the drop down or what is happening, but I'm pretty sure that shouldn't there's no point to that. There's no benefit to me as a user that happens. So I'm assuming that that's actually not necessarily a good thing. That would be something that I would probably want to report as should this really be doing this? Possibly an issue. So even when I'm just doing my health check, so what happens if I just drop that? It goes back. So even when I'm just doing my health check, I'm exploring and learning about the application. And that might be important because it may have changed slightly from the last time that I did this. So my initial session took 20 minutes. I've summarized it there for you in whatever that was, 10 minutes. But the first session, the first real session, was a health check session. And it was based around the CRUD concept, the create, read, update, delete. Can I do the basic steps that I need to? And the lessons are, all testing essentially is exploration and observation. And I was doing that through the health check. The exploration is boosted by the technical knowledge of the app, right? That I identified things I need to investigate there because I'm seeing stuff happen that I believe is related to JavaScript. I'm seeing stuff that might be CSS related. So I need to learn the technology to help me go through. This was time boxed. I originally gave myself half an hour to do it. It took 20 minutes. I made notes of the times as I was going through to track it. I made exploratory testing notes as I was going through this process. I have my notes that I can refer back to, and they're pretty detailed. And the reason that I'm going back and redoing the recording of the sessions is to check how good my notes are. This is essentially a review process for my notes. I can see that I'm alerting myself to things that I did not do. Right? I didn't check in the database. I didn't health check the API. All the validation that I'm doing, all the observation of did this work is being done on the GUI itself. And I've made notes on defect Now, one of the things I noticed in there is that sometimes this can be a little bit hard to click if you go the wrong way, right? It hovers up, I come over here, it goes away. You have to be pretty quick to come down to it. So again, that's a kind of usability type issue that I've mentioned in my notes. Now, my plan for this was essentially just a crud, make sure this thing works in the health check. But what was important was that as I did the testing, I made more notes than I did prior. So exploratory testing is really trying to emphasize the gathering of evidence rather than the upfront planning. And we track our notes to help keep us on track. It'd be very easy for me to go off track during the session and follow all these things that I don't know and understand. But the concept I've got in my head is create, read, amend, delete, or create, read, update, delete. And until I've done that, I don't really want to go off track too far. And the time boxing can also help. The recording that I've made here is also evidence. I didn't take screenshots as I went through originally because I knew I was coming back. But some of the later sessions, I've been taking screenshots as I go through to gather evidence as they come through, because I didn't start with all the tooling available. I didn't know there was going to be so much on screen that I was going to try and capture as I did my exploration. So having done the health check session, I know I need to have a screenshot tool very handy to support me, because there's stuff happening in here that I may find hard to recreate, or I may forget about, or I may want to capture the nuances at the time that I see it. So I know I'm identifying some of the tooling that I need as I go through very quickly. But one of the key essences is to gather as much evidence as possible. So I think that's probably all I want to say about that particular session. So that's a health check session to make sure that the system is actually suitable for testing. And again, automated execution might help with that, but we don't have any here, so I'm doing this purely exploratory. So this may be one of the most common questions that I'm asked. How do you know what to test? How do you choose what to test? And there's so many different ways. So this particular section is split into, I think, 3 lectures. So this is just a short intro into choosing what to test. But how do I know what to test? Well, I do kind of planning sessions. I build models. I investigate it. But I rely on everything that is around me in the team. So if we have requirements, I will use those. I will use those as a basis. Now, one of the things that's interesting in kind of ISTQB terminology, I think they got one thing right where they talk about test basis, which I don't think we used to talk about, not in those terms. I used to talk about test conditions, not necessarily test basis, but I think basis is a useful word. So if we have requirements, I'll use those. If we have stories, I'll use those. If we have defects, change requests, commits, but I'll also use the models that I've built up over time as I am testing. But since at this point I haven't done any testing, right, I'm focused on the requirements, stories, and information that we have to hand. And the processes we go through in terms of discussing stories is really important to identify what it is we're actually going to test. So for this particular application, I'm going to test holistically. So I'm going to test the system rather than the story, which is basically analogous to an agile process where we've tested all the stories, we've tested all the tasks independently, and at some point, all of those stories exist in the application at the same time, and we want to look for, do these impact each other? And this is very often something that is missed out on a lot of projects because we work on story basis, but don't look at, okay, holistically, how do these fit into the system? What is the user now going to be able to do across these flows? So very often, just by the nature of the design process used on agile projects, we miss out a whole type of approaching testing holistically. And I'm using the phrase holistically simply because system testing is vague, ambiguous. It could be functional testing, it could be flow testing. Holistically means I'm going to look at the entire thing. I could use other words, but that's just how I tend to communicate that these days. I'm going to assume that other testing has been performed, right? This is an open source application. There is release notes. There may be automated tests. I don't know. I'm going to assume that. So in order for me to figure out what I'm going to test now, I've got my overriding approach, which is testing holistically, but I need to plan what I'm going to do. I need to figure that out. So that's what the next session is, how I do the planning. So how do we know what to test? We plan. And for some people, planning is a dirty word because they're on Agile, the notion that you plan things. We do exploratory testing. We learn as we go. We don't plan. Everyone plans. Planning is key to how we work. It's how we focus. So planning is an important stage. And you can see in this model here, pretty much before I do anything, I'm planning what I'm going to do, even if that's as simple as what is my next action? What is the next objective I want to achieve? What is the next question I want to ask? That's planning. And that is a key step. Right, so when I'm planning, I treat that as a session. Right, so very often what happens is when we do testing, a lot of the work that we do doesn't make its way into the tracking system. It's not visible to people. They don't know what we're doing. So the only thing they see are huge gaps of time, then an hour where we did some testing, then defects magically appear and testers running about asking questions, right? It's really important that if you can, chunk your work as much as possible into sessions. I mean, I do this in my daily notes, regardless of whether I'm putting it into a tracking system or not. So I will have in my daily notes a timestamp, what I'm trying to achieve at this point in time. At the top of my daily notes, there'll be a list that says, here's what I'm trying to achieve today. And I'll pull the objectives out of there, then play them, put a timestamp in, start making notes as I'm going through, record the time, record interruptions. And that it's my entire life is chunked into sessions. But that's because I've been looking at different time management approaches for years. And the most common time management approach is track your high level objectives. Don't spend too much time on doing that because you'll spend more time planning than actually doing. So plan the high level objectives, then decide to play one of the high level objectives. Plan it in enough detail so you know what you're doing, so that you know that you're still on track, so you know that it's still important. Then track what you actually do, make progress. When you finish, debrief, see if there's any new information that comes in. Will that impact your plan? Have you learned anything? And that, what I just described there, is a time management approach. It's the essence of agile story planning, right? All of these things are the same. It's session-based test management. All of this, I keep thinking session-based time management because really, James and John took a time management process and mapped it onto testing because that's what they were doing. They were managing the time they were spending on testing. So that's how it translates. Now, the planning process itself is an exploratory process, right? We're investigating what we want to achieve, what are the aims, what are the questions, what are the factors involved, what are the risks, and it's a decision-making process. We can track it and plan it like any other activity. If we know that we're going to have to do a whole bunch of testing, we can plan in a planning session before that, which might only be 20 minutes, and to think through what we're going to do before we actually do it. Planning can be planned. One of the issues that I think people have with planning, they get nervous that they've got to plan it in real detail. But we don't. We go as deeply into it as we currently understand based on the models that we have in our heads. Sometimes the planning process will let us know that we don't really understand what we're about to do. Therefore, we know that it's going to be hard to estimate because we're working with unknowns. We know that we can't plan it in too much detail because it's liable to change. We know that we're working variable information. Therefore, we don't want to write everything down to the local steps. But if we don't plan, then we may not have the resources that we need to hand. We may not realize that we need access to the database before we do the testing. So we may start, hit a blocker, stop, because we didn't think it through effectively, which is really what planning is. But sometimes people don't plan because they're agile, or because they're exploratory, or because whatever their misunderstanding of a particular word is. But if we don't plan, then we're losing the opportunity to effectively target our testing, to think about it, to identify our aims and objectives, to really keep on point and test as effectively as humanly possible. So the results of my planning session, and you can see this in the PDF, and it fits onto one slide, which is nice. And it only took me 10 minutes, right? So 10 minutes for me in the planning session was, what am I going to use to test? So I know that there's release notes. Should I look at the commits or the defects? Should I just think about general functionality? And I've written down the things that I'm thinking about. So I made the decision to go holistic, which I already mentioned. I had a look in the release notes and saw that there was a statement, you can now change the state of a context to closed. And I thought, okay, there's a lot in there. There's a lot of ambiguity in there. What is a context? What's a context state? What states are there? It doesn't mention that in there. How many are there? Is it an actual state machine? Are all the states valid? Are there transition rules? There's a lot of ambiguity in there to investigate. And it may be clear if someone knows the system well, but I don't. So I can create some sessions for investigating this, for looking in this. So I've made a decision. In 10 minutes, I've focused it in. I've rejected certain approaches for doing it. So I know what I'm not covering. Like the planning session is also about identifying what you're not going to do, what the potential risks of not doing that are. And I track it, I write it down because it's useful to revisit and go, oh yeah, we kind of thought about that, but discounted it for these reasons. So that's the result of my planning session. So one of the things I have to do is decide what on earth I'm going to test. And we have to do this all the time as we go through a project. So very often we'll have requirements. They're often driven by stories on an agile project or what the person wants to achieve. And we might look at, when we've got a story, how this thing has been implemented, right? In order to understand if there's any technical risk or functional descriptions, or take into account the unit testing that's been there. We have to, very often when we're working on agile, and this is really important, is that we have to look at the decisions and constraints that are made during development, because sometimes stories span multiple sprints. So we're constrained by the fact that the full story is not there. The validation may not be fully implemented. The integration with other parts of the system may not be fully there. So the testing that we do in sprint has to adjust to that and may not really be of as much value as we hope. And it can make testing look like it takes a long time because we'll be testing the story at each point through the sprint. But when we get to the very last sprint, when the full story comes together, people are expecting it to take less time because it's a tiny little change, but now the full story is there. But we look at it and go, well, now the full story is there. So now I have to take into account all the things that we have built in, all the validation rules. How does this integrate with the system and go beyond the story acceptance criteria? So this can really impact our testing. I tend to think of it in terms of, we've got the in-sprint work, the story work, and then system testing. And by system testing, I mean the system as a whole, like stories in combination, functional flows throughout the system that span multiple stories, going beyond the acceptance criteria that's listed in the story. And this is the part that's often neglected on agile projects, and it's how things slip through, because very often we're so focused on the acceptance criteria and the automated assertion of the acceptance criteria. But for me, because I have to decide what I'm doing and I'm not working on the project here on an agile or sprint basis, I'm almost working on the go beyond the story basis, right? Because I have to figure out, well, how can I do something as an exercise here that can add value? So I assume that the team working on tracks have tested it. They've done unit testing. They've checked out their stories. What I do then is go, right, where can I add value in that process? And it's by looking at the project holistically, looking at going beyond just the functionality in isolation. So where can I find out what is important to test? So I've got the release notes. All right, this is the most obvious place to look for items to test. I could go through the source code. I could look at all the changes that I've made, the check-ins that have been done. I could look at all the bug fixes and retest those. But I'm looking at this in terms of how can I add value. So I have to go beyond what I believe the team has already done. So I'm going to pick one of these items, which is you can now change the state of a context to closed. I'm just going to pick that one. I could pick any of these. I could pick something completely random. But this, to me, it is interesting, right? Because we're talking about state. So as soon as we have state, I'm thinking of a state machine. I'm wondering if there's constraints. I don't know all the states that it can be in. I don't know what else impacts the context state. I don't know what other entities are related to that. Because very often with state machines are analogous to entity life history diagrams from the olden days. An entity life history diagram is kind of a hierarchy of states that the entity can go through. Entities relate to each other. So entities in different states may relate in different ways. So I have to look at not just the state of a context, but what else the context relates to see if the state impacts that. So I think that's, even though that's a very subtle and small thing, I think there's a rich vein in there to tap and to explore in short bursts, because that's what this course is, short bursts of testing. So I'm going to focus in on that. And then I'm starting to think, well, what are my questions around that? I don't know what context is. It's been so long since I used tracks, I've forgotten. I don't know what a context is. I don't know what the context state is. I don't know how many states there are. I don't know if it's a state machine. I don't know if all states are valid as each other. I don't know if there's transition rules or constraints between. So I'm going to have to find that out. But this video is a representation of a planning session, a decision session, right? Because we have to spend time planning our work and making decisions about what we're going to do next. And we can track that as sessions. They're perfectly valid things to track as sessions because that is an exploratory process. Thinking through what I'm going to test is an exploratory process because I considered multiple factors. I considered whether I was going to read the manual, look at the code. I thought this through to see if it's rich enough. That was a session. It was a time-bound session. It took me, I think, 10, 15 minutes to try and figure out what I'm going to test in a planning session. So I'm going to go macro to this to see what I learned, which is a 10-minute planning session, and I've spent 4 videos on this, right? Because this is so absolutely important to what we do. Prior to doing anything, plan it, think about it, get your head sorted, get your aims and objectives, figure this out. So when we're looking at what do I actually use to test? We often have stories in agile projects, and very often people get hung up on, well, they must be given when then. As a user, I want to blah de blah, right? We must state why someone wants it. Very often people are inflexible in their language, and that I think is an issue. But that just means that there's more ambiguity, which means there's more scope for questioning. Now, when I'm working on agile projects and I ask questions, I will write them down. I will write down the answers. I will put those written notes possibly in the tracking system if it's feasible to make them public and it's politically acceptable to make them public. I will make my notes public. Otherwise, they'll stay in my notes so that I know what we discussed and what time, with whom, so that if there's any issues, we can come back and go, well, on this day we said we weren't going to do this, so we said that this was out of scope in this story, so we're not testing that. But it's important often to know what drives the requirement, because then we can test around it. Because one of the key things we want to be able to do is test around these stories, to go holistic to the stories and not just focus on the actual details.
One of the things that people very often miss out is they only look at the acceptance criteria. They don't look at how has it been built. How do people describe that? Where are the risk areas? Are there new technologies in here? Have we just adopted and brought in a new library into the system? All of these things can be risk, which we can look at in terms of testing. We can also use like decisions and constraints during the development to force us to test differently, because sometimes we'll have stories and they may not have validation yet. We've decided not to put any validation in place, so there's no error handling, so we won't test that. But very often that then drops out and it just magically appears at the end, but we then have a whole bunch more testing to do. Priorities and agreed risk areas, they're important for driving it, because we do have to agree where our focus is going to be when we test. We don't just make this up, we discuss it and agree as a project where our focus and priority is going to be. And the more we do that, the more we are sharing responsibility for testing rather than taking it all on board ourselves. If we take on board all the decision making about testing and we skip an area, it's perfectly valid for people to come and go, why did you not test this? If you share that knowledge, prioritization, agreed risk areas, thought processes, more people are involved and you get less of that blame game. If you do take responsibility for it, then you have to cover yourself by writing down the decisions that were made, the reasons you made those choices, what impacted it, why you decided not to do something because person X said this in meeting Y. Make those things written down so that you know why you made particular decisions. We should also look at some of the ways that we figure this stuff out in Agile processes, because most people will be doing Agile. So very often in Agile, we've got the in-sprint testing. So what we're often looking at there is we're constrained to the work done scope, right? We won't do error handling testing yet. There's no focus on security. We're not looking at performance yet. So we're artificially constraining what we might think about as we test. We do need to track these emissions as coverage gaps for later testing. Otherwise, it can slip away, right? Or we forgot to do performance testing because no one mentioned it in the acceptance criteria. When we played the last story in this functionality, in this feature, and we said, well, what about performance testing? They said, well, it's not going live yet, so we won't do that. Then when it goes live, we forgot about it, right? We have to track these things and think them through. And where possible, do them in sprints, but sometimes we're going to be constrained. And we're very often testing bits of stories for some reason. A lot of Agile projects don't need to be Agile projects, right? Because we're not delivering value to the user at the end of each sprint. So a more Kanban-like approach where the stories take as long as they take until they're ready can reduce that. But very often we'll take features and split them into stories in order to fit them into sprints, where we release something at the end of the sprint, but only into the test environment and not to the user. So we can have half done work, but it looks like completed work because it was stories. So we very often have the notion that in sprint testing is constrained and there will be gaps. So we have to figure out a way of tracking that, either on wiki pages, but you need something that's going holistically outside the scope of the normal planning process. Stories hopefully are complete chunks of work, but sometimes they're not. Sometimes stories span sprints because they're not finished. So we have work rolling over. That can be an issue if we are going live with a particular set of stories or feature set, because we then have to test it in a state that it's not designed to go live with to make sure it works, which takes time away from other activities we could be doing in sprint. To be honest, a lot of Agile planning and processes are a complete mess, but we have to figure out how to handle that in our test approach to help mitigate the risk of omission or commission, like missing something out or doing something that we're not supposed to. That making sure that feature toggles work, and there can be a huge combinatorial explosion when we do that, when we choose to go live with half-finished work that was never designed to be there. And very often it's right at the end where we're squeezed in. We need to go beyond acceptance criteria. So acceptance criteria is a start point. We need to ask more questions. We need to quiz in the ambiguity. What's a good approach for acceptance criteria is having automated execution, because acceptance criteria is very often, it must do this. When we say this, it must respond in this particular way. They can be very simple assertions that we write in automated execution, which is very often why we, in sprints, automate as much as possible, but we're really only automating the acceptance criteria. We need to go beyond that with our testing. And if we have automated the acceptance criteria, hopefully we've automated in such a way that we can reuse the abstractions that we create for that to support us in our exploratory testing to do massive data coverage. If we can do that, that's great. A lot of random data thrown in, temporary, tactical, automated execution to help us cover the acceptance criteria in more detail whilst allowing us to do exploratory testing somewhere else. We have the issue that stories are often tested in isolation, in small chunks. Sometimes we're working on a branch where that story exists and we test it there, but then when we merge it in, we rely on automated execution in the continuous integration process, checking the merge. That's probably not enough, but agile processes can be hard to test in simply because of that small focused chunk aspect. Now, we have the issue of system testing is a very vague term. And after a merge, we probably want to do system testing, where we're testing the integration of all these stories in combination. We're looking at how people might use this in live. We're looking for API calls that then show up in a story, but that wasn't mentioned in the acceptance criteria. We want to look at using the stories in different orders because certain users have different needs. This is one of the key areas that is missed out in agile projects, going beyond the acceptance criteria and the stories. So, this is why I focused on that in tracks, which is very often how I'm able to find defects, right? It's because I'm going beyond what other people are doing. So with tracks, the release notes were there. I was able to review them. I read this, I focused, and I zoomed in on something. And I was kind of lucky that that thing that I zoomed in actually had some issues and problems, which made the testing even more valuable than just as a process. When I'm doing this, and I do this on actual projects, right? I assume that people have done story testing, they've done acceptance criteria, that all the stories are complete, that people have done the reviews. So I'm not going to focus in on those aspects. I'm not going to review the automated execution because there's a whole bunch of risk of duplicated effort and scope if I don't do that, but that's fine, right? Because I assume that most of the time when people do automated execution, they work in tiny chunks rather than the kind of testing that I'm going to do. One question is, how does a manager add value on an agile project? And this isn't a joke, right? This is a real question. How does a manager add value in an agile project? Because I've had to be manager on agile projects, and I've had to try and figure out how to add value and support the testers. But I don't have the time very often in huge chunks to focus in on a story, right? And someone on the project will be able to focus in on a story for 2 or 3 days potentially, and they'll be able to test that. I might only have half an hour, 15 minutes. How can I add value on a project? I do that by looking at the project holistically. I look at the gaps in people's thinking. I know that people are focused on functionality. I know that they very often don't have time to look beyond it, to look at how stories are interacting. So very often that's where I look. So I use the process and look for risks in that process to drive my testing. I look where others don't. I go more technical. I look at the messages because I know people aren't looking at those things. Essentially, I look wherever anyone else has not looked. And I do that by trying to get a handle on the process people have used and to look at it holistically. And this is a key thing to try and do. If you can build this skill, modeling not just the application, but modeling the process that people are using and understanding the risks that imposes on a project, you will be able to find defects and you will be able to add value. You will be able to expose ambiguity that other people are not seeing. And you can do this as a manager, which is fantastic because you can use whatever gaps you have to add value into processes. And the project will hate you for this. They don't love this stuff. But sometimes you come up with really important things that they have to spend an entire sprint or two fixing because it was a gap in what they were thinking. So recon sessions. I mean, this is a term that is used a lot in military. We're going to do recon, and if you look in commando handbooks or things like that. It's also used in security testing a lot, where they do recon to find out the scope that is available to them. Not necessarily the scope that people said was there, but the scope that is available to them. And recon is really important to help you debrief and feed into your planning process. Recon is really important to help you build models. Recon is really important to help you understand. Recon is really important to ask very small questions, get information back that might change your view of how your testing should approach this particular application. So my chosen scope was in the release notes, where you can now change the state of a context to closed. Great. But I don't know what that means yet, right? So I'm going to have to do something to find out. So I need an exploration process, a recon process to do that. On some teams, that might be going to speak to the product owner and the programmer and looking at how it's built, and possibly. So for me, I only have one place to ask these questions, which is the application. So I need to create a session around the context state to help me answer these questions, to know what that actually means, which means I then have to do a recon session. So I have chosen what I'm going to test. I've figured out what my scope is going to be. I've planned what I'm going to do. Now, what's interesting for me is I don't actually know what that real scope means yet. I don't know what the requirement means. So the thing that I'm going to target is you can now change the state of a context to closed, but I don't know what that means. But what I do have is some models of that in terms of both state machines. And I know how to explore state machines. So I have a vague concept of a state machine in here, and I have the concept of an entity called context, but I don't really know how that fits into the application. So rather than just immediately starting to test this particular concept, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a recon session, right? Because I have to build models. I have to understand what it is that I'm working with. And so I'm going to start with an aim, which is to try and understand and model this, right? The rough charter that I created, the set of questions to explore this, to figure out if and what it is I have to actually do here to come up with a more concrete scope and plan. So I've made my notes as I went through. When I started, what the time was, the application is now running on a different IP address because I've restarted the virtual machine. So I'm trying to figure out, well, what is a context, right? So a context is, I can see it here. So I can create a context when I create a to-do item on the home screen. So then I'm wondering, well, what are the views to read this? So I'm thinking in terms of CRUD, like the context is an entity. So I can create it here. Where can I read it? I can read it there. I can see it's there. Where can I update it? There's an organized there with context. I've got an edit button there. I can edit the context there. Where else can I update it? I can update it on the context view itself. And then I have to see that I've got a different edit view there. So but I can't edit the state here. So there's a place where I can edit the state and a place where I can edit the entity itself. So I'm exploring the application just to try and learn where that entity fits into the application. I assume that if I do something to the context, then I'll be able to export it, because export says context. So that can be a good source for observing the expected results. So now I've got access to observation at the GUI and observation of an extract. I haven't yet extended my observation abilities into the API. I know there's an API. I haven't extended it to how things are created by looking at the messages that are sent back and forward. So I'm making notes on that in my actual exploratory notes. I did notice as I was exploring this that there was a defect, a perceived defect on the start view here with this drop down.
you can see I've got a different result now than I had earlier on. It's lucky I captured the screenshot. There's differences in how this is rendered, but I mean, clearly that rendering is not as good as it should be, and clearly the rendering that I experienced earlier on was not as good as it should be. But there's a variation in there that I don't understand why it would be different from one to another, because this is the same browser that I was using earlier on. That's one of the reasons why it's useful to capture images as we go through our testing and exploration, because things change, and if we don't have evidence of that, I might not even have realized that what I'm seeing here, although this is not correct, is different from what I thought was not correct before. So having figured out that how to change the state, I don't do it in that one, I do it in, I can change, organize. I can change the state in here, and then it will move between these different contexts. So then I started to experiment with this and changing it to closed, do an update, and then I get this message: state cannot be changed. The context cannot be closed if you have uncompleted actions in this context. So I can see that there's a guard on one of the state transitions. Can I hide it when there's an unsaved thing? Yes, I can. Can I move it back to the state that it was in before, even though it has these actions? And the answer is yes, I can. So I can't move it to closed, but there seems to be no constraint moving from active to hidden. So that's interesting. We have a constraint. Let's move that to closed, and it says no, we can't do it. And then I thought, okay, so I can't move context into closed when there's uncompleted actions. But what if I have a closed context? Can I add an action which is incomplete to a context which is closed? The context B is closed. So let's add this to context B. And yeah, I can do that fine. So I cannot move a context into a closed state when it has uncompleted actions, but I can add uncompleted actions into a context that has a closed state. And I don't know if that's a bug or not, but it feels like I shouldn't be able to do that. It feels like I shouldn't necessarily let me do that. And I've explored that in my notes in here. Now, what I've also done, I mean, that's a mild distraction, right? Because what I'm supposed to be doing are learning the rules around this, not necessarily testing it. But the session was so short that I followed that through. I've made a notes of a more formal set of transitions that I want to do. I've also made notes on, well, can I move from the current state to the current state? Now, when I edit the context in here, and I change the name, and I go, and I leave the state active, did I change it from active to active? Now, I don't know, because I don't have the ability to observe the system at a low enough level to know whether it put the state across at the same time. So I've got limits in my ability to observe the system which prevent me from testing effectively parts of the system. So I know I need to increase my visibility. So I'm going to need tooling in order to do that. And then I started to explore what entities relate to other entities, and then I found that it was odd being able to add that to do into a context that is already closed. So I would probably raise that as a bug. And I've gone through here looking at are there any other state combinations? Because there's not a lot of entities in here. We've got contexts, we've got to-dos, we've got notes, we've got repeating to-dos. And again, look, we've got a rendering issue in here. So really I need to get the screenshot tool up to have that, to capture that rendering issue. So in the repeating to-dos, can I create a repeating action for a context that is closed? What would happen under that situation? Would it be fine? Would it work? Should that happen? And it's that overlap between state machines that I'm finding interesting, because it wasn't mentioned at the front. And that's why I'm thinking, that holistic view, looking at the system, looking at going beyond the story and looking at stories in combination,
And it doesn't have to be stories when we think about that. It can be entities in the system. It can be functionality in the system, stuff that was there already that we take for granted, but we put in something new, like a new state, and we've got some constraints, but does it work at all the constraints? And then I'm thinking, well, does the API enforce these constraints, or can I bypass these constraints by going through the API? And again, in order to test that, I would need more tooling, because I can't do that through the front end. So because this was a Recon session, I summarized my findings to help me go forward, because what I'm doing really is building a model of this concept. So I've got my model, I've got my constraints, and I've made some notes about what to do, and made some notes about what I might do going forward. And that whole session had a gap in the middle of 8 minutes, because someone came to my front door, and I started at when did I start? There we go. 22 minutes past 12, and finished at 13 minutes past 13. So that's less than an hour. Now, I didn't really put limits on the session, right? I didn't have a timer, but what I've done is I've just tracked my time. And as you can see, that I stuck in some timestamps as I went through, because I was conscious that I was making a lot of notes, but not necessarily tracking the time. So I've got my to-dos in there. I can revisit this. The notes are quite detailed. I can use that to debrief someone else. I can use that to revisit to help me plan other sessions. But I've also got my model, which was the key point for the Recon session, to understand how this fits together and how I want to work with it in the future. This would lead on to a planning session, so that when I come up with my other charters, I know what it is I'm going to do. And also, there's nothing really different about the functional testing in here, right? I used all my functional testing thought processes to come through, to work out the state transitions, to explore the state transitions, to see if I can skip states. But what is key here is that my modeling and assessment of my findings is limited by my ability to observe the system, and I'm limited by my ability to manipulate the system. Because can I move a state from the current state into the current state? I don't know if that's what that functionality did, and if it didn't, I need the ability to send through whatever message it sends when it's changing state, to change it from one state to the other in order to do that transition. So I'm currently limited by the technology that I'm using. But because I understand the architecture of the system, I know what technology and tooling I need to bring in to help me. So I don't start with tools. I iterate towards tool usage as required, as I hit limits in my ability to test and observe the system. Let's go a bit meta on the Recon session. I have to plan before doing a Recon session. My Recon session is about helping me understand what's going on. So I'm still making notes, right? Every time I hit anything in a session, I'm making notes. Anytime I'm going into a meeting to discuss how the story works, I'm going to make notes. Anytime I go over to someone's desk, I'm going to make notes, and I'll tidy them up when I come back, because these are exploratory, investigative sessions to help me understand. And I'm making notes, I'm making to-dos, I'm writing down the findings, I'm asking extra questions, I'm making notes on what things seem to be, but I'm not doing a lot of interrogation to find out. Sometimes I will, sometimes I won't, because it's a Recon session. I'll do whatever I need to look at in order to get things working. I'm tracking any defects that I see, again, and I'm asking questions as I go through to help drive my investigation. And again, I'm making notes on my questions, what I'm thinking about, what the answers are. This is a session just like anything else. We don't necessarily know what we will find when we do these sessions, but we know what our aim is, and the aim is for me to come out the other end with a better understanding of the context to know how to test it. And at the end of my session, I made some findings. This isn't a debrief summary. This is just a kind of in situ set of findings. So this is my rough model at the time, right? I've got to-dos or actions. They can be added into contexts. I seem to be able to move context into different states in any order, right? But I know that I need to cover that in more detail. I did find one constraint that I cannot move a context to closed if it has open actions, which seems like something that would be really good to drill into in more detail, because that's a constraint. It has to be enforced. How many ways are there of potentially bypassing it? I know also that I can add open actions to closed contexts when I create an action, which to me seems to violate the constraint. So I think there's a lot of scope in there for looking at that state and the overlap between actions and actual constraint and contexts. I found it a little bit odd that all contexts are shown in the drop-down. I would have thought that closed contexts wouldn't be there. I haven't investigated how the system actually updates the backend. It looks like it's XHR requests, but I'm not completely sure. So I know that I'm making a note that I need to get more detailed in my investigation. And even though XHR is used, there's no observation pattern so that all screens are sent messages or screens are polling the back end to see if the state of what they're displaying is complete. So there's a potential there for multi-user access, possibly overriding someone's state change without being informed about it. Who knows, right? There's extra scope in there that is occurring to me when I'm doing this. So I've got new test ideas on how I can approach this. So going meta to this. The basics of functional testing are functional testing, right? All the stuff that we've learned about boundary values, odd values, error validation, functional flows, looking at different ways, ordering, checking defaults, whatever you know about functional testing, that remains the same in any testing session. But the architecture and technology change how we test, right? They change our ability to observe the system. My ability to model this and assess the findings is limited by my ability to observe. I didn't have anything that was looking at the network traffic, so I don't really know how this system is properly working. I'm limited in how I'm approaching things. Therefore, I know that I need additional tools to go through. I know that I may need to understand more of the technology, and this is an evolving process as we test, as we work on the project. I don't start with a particular tool set. I don't start with a particular list of technologies that I'm going to study. I iterate over these things as I work on projects, as I work on the system, to help me ensure that my ability to interrogate the system, observe the system, manipulate the system at all the different touch points increases as required to be the right person to test this. That's constantly what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to evolve to make sure that I am the best person to test this, so that when we do actually get to the end of this project, I am at the peak of being able to test this particular application, this particular technology, this particular functionality, and I'll learn that over time. I may not be able to de-risk that at the start, but that's fine. I've been put on the project and I'm evolving as we go through, which helps de-risk the fact that I'm on the project in the first place. So it's everything is an exploratory process. Our learning, our skill sets, even as we work on it, is an exploratory process. So the Recon's given me quite a lot of information so far. I've got a lot of notes. Remember, I haven't really started testing at this point. So what I really want to do is debrief, is get my head round what it is I've actually done. So I'm going to look through the notes that I've got. I'm going to try and collate them into some sort of summary so I understand the status that I'm at. If this was a real project, I'd be pulling out the issues, the to-dos, the questions. I'd be clarifying those with the team. I'd be writing down the defects and raising those in a system. Even though I haven't started testing yet, I've learned a lot of stuff and I just want to codify that in my head. And that's going to feed into a planning or a modeling session. So the way I do the debrief is I've got all my notes. I basically just start at the top,
then start working through them. And what I'll do is I'll have the notes that I've taken in whatever format, and I'll have a completely clean editing session up. I'll just write down debrief session, the time, date, so that I'm always tracking what time I'm doing. I write down the aims for my session, which is to review notes, blah, blah, blah. So I've always got an aim, right? Every time I'm doing something, whatever it is, if you want to call that a charter, that's fine. You want to call that objectives, aim, plan, whatever it is, I don't mind. I'm just clear in my head, this is what I'm going to do from this point until I finish. And if it seems like it's taking too long, I'll add more timestamps in here so that I can track it. And I just went through making all my notes, expanding it, and I've made a decision, right? What I need to do is I need to explore the state and entity life history relationships in more detail, and move this into a planning and modeling session to prep for a more comprehensive coverage approach. Because one of the things that happens when you're doing exploratory testing is you get wrapped up in it. It can be hard to step back, do the modeling, understand the scope of what you've done. So we need to put sessions in place where we can do that. And for me, that's a debrief session. What do other people call this? Not stepping back, but defocusing, I think some people call this. But for me, this is a debrief. I'm debriefing with myself. And this is an invaluable process when you're working on your own. Very often we're testing on our own. We can't bring someone over and say, "Hey, interrupt what you're doing, come and look at my stuff." It's useful to have that. If you're doing a formal session-based test management process, you have that. In the absence of that, and most people are working in the absence of that, we can do these debriefs on our own by looking through our notes. And if our notes are good enough, that will be fine. If the notes are not good enough, then we need to make them good enough to support this process, because this process is essential for getting our head round. We're modeling what we've done. We're building a status of where we are. We're reflecting on what has happened. This is absolutely essential to our process. And you can see that what I've also done is, as I went through here, I collated the times so that I know how much time I've spent on this and what I'm working through. And I made decisions going forward. And basically, I then took these notes. If I was working in Jira, I might post these into a task on Jira. If I'm working more informally, I'll save this as a file. At the moment, I'm just saving everything in a big block in Evernote. That seems to work fine for me for what I'm doing here. But I now have a reflection of what I've got. If it was a real project, I would do more in terms of writing down all the questions. They'd be stated here as questions, to-dos, so that I could plan things down, issues, so that I could raise those. And then I go and communicate this to the team, ask questions. Because remember, I have no idea when I'm testing this particular application if the things that I'm seeing that I think are problems are problems. I don't know if it's a problem that I can add a new action to a closed to-do. I think that's a problem because it seems like bypassing a constraint, but I don't know that. So if this is a real project at this point in time, I would be communicating and asking that. As it is, I'm going to build that in to my next exploratory session because that gives me something more to focus on. So the next session I'm going to do after this is a modeling session to help me get my head round what it is I've actually got to try and explore, what coverage I want to build on that, but what models I want to use for that coverage. So debriefs are essential. You can see in this model here, debrief is happening after every single type of session. The only session it didn't happen after is a planning session. But in theory, that's part of the planning session, debrief, to make sure that we're happy with the plan that we've got working forward. And essentially, we revisit that plan when we start doing any other session anyway. So in concepts like session-based test management or formal management of exploratory testing, the debrief session is often done with someone else. So you sit down, debrief, you'll pair with them, you'll go through your notes, you might have the system up and running at the same time to demonstrate, oh, I did this, that's how we interpret the notes to trigger your information, to have a look at the data in more detail. Sometimes it's as simple as just sitting down with someone and working through what you've done. Debrief sessions are
so key, but people sometimes leave them out when they're actually working on their own. And we can't afford to do that. So by debrief session, it basically means stepping back a little bit, looking at what we've done. It might mean tidying up my notes. It might mean collating my notes so that I look through and pull out all the to-dos. I pull out all the defects, which gives me the chance then to plan a admin session for raising defects, an admin session for updating the test conditions that we might use in the future, right? All of this collation process. And I will track this collation process because it's a debrief session. I will track the time that I take on it to work out what we're doing. I might refine the models, the notes that I made on the models, but I might also then have to plan a modeling session later if it becomes clear that it's going to take quite a long time to actually plan this, and that my debrief session is really moving into a modeling and planning session. So again, I have to be careful about bleeding the sessions across. So debrief sessions is a way of tidying up, making us clear of what we did, and recognizing if we didn't achieve enough coverage, so potentially creating some to-dos to revisit some of the charter that we said we were going to work on. Debrief session is absolutely key. I can't stress it enough. So my notes were relatively small for the debrief session. My debrief session started at 10:40 and scroll. When did we finish? At 10:53. So this was a 13-minute process. I wrote down my aims to try and figure out what I'm going to do. I summarized what I did. I made notes on what I need to do going forward. I've also said that I tidied up my notes to had a timing session so that I can track this. And then I've made notes on what I would actually do on an ongoing basis next for an admin session if I was doing this in a real project, where I'd take all the to-dos, take all the defects, raise the defects, ask the questions of the people on the team. This is what a debrief session is, to figure out, well, what is my next action? It's kind of like a planning session, but it can lead into a proper planning session, but it's taken all the information from what we learned, because sometimes we have to, when we do exploratory testing, we have to extract our coverage. We have to extract the questions that we had, because we cover so much stuff in that short period of time that the debrief session is a way of pulling as much value, much extra value out of that beyond the observations and interrogations that we made during the session. So this is a way of pulling out more value. Debrief is absolutely key. It's why at the end of the day, I will look through my notes and debrief and write down what went well, what didn't, what I want to do carrying forward. Are there any new things I want to track? Am I still on track? My overall goals. These debriefs are just a standard to-do management approach, and just management approach for getting better and improving. It is a feedback mechanism, because it is information coming out of our process that is feeding back into helping us do the next thing. So lessons learned. So I rely on linear notes. So I just make my notes in order, right? And I use my debrief session to potentially add in summaries, to potentially add more titles in there, to potentially add more structure. I very often don't edit the notes very much, but I can do that in the debrief. I tend not to worry about formatting and aesthetics very much, but because I'm very often writing in Markdown, I may go back and add extra blank lines to make sure things format in Markdown. I do tend to use text files a lot. I do use Evernote, but sometimes Evernote is a little bit clumsy to work with, because Evernote adds formatting. When I start writing Markdown, Evernote will add extra formatting there. It'd be really good. The ideal for me would be Evernote supported Markdown, but I could paste screenshots in, and then when I extract it as text, it extracts out the whole thing. But I haven't found a proper editor that does that, so I tend to use text files. Cloud App is really good screenshot tool, because it will paste a URL into my clipboard. So when I take a screenshot, there's a URL there. I can paste that directly into my notes, which is brilliant. Different tools in combination work in different ways. But my standard approach is I'll have all screenshots in an images folder, because that's kind of standard for working with Markdown. What I often find is that having done a debrief, I've got a summary of what I'm doing or what I've done, which I can then use as a status report to copy or paste into Jira or whatever management system we're using. So I may not put my raw notes into there. They may be saved somewhere else, but the summaries at a minimum will be put into the overall project tracking system so that people have insight and visibility into the testing that I'm doing. But the debrief is an absolutely key approach when we do exploratory testing. So I moved on to a modeling session. Right? When I went through the debrief, I made some notes and I realized I need to try and understand the context, the states, the action states, and the relationship between those two entities and their life cycle in more detail, so that I can try and identify and plan for a better coverage approach to feed into my exploratory testing. And you can see here in my notes, I'm saying, see the notes that I made on the Smart Pen, right? Because I want to try and do things as effectively as possible, as fast as possible. So I'm not going to get out a diagramming tool and start diagramming. I am going to make notes. And the way that I make notes is I have a Smart Pen. And you can see here at the top of my notes, it says test new pen, right? Because my Smart Pen broke and I used the guarantee and got another one and it's working. So now when I write on my Smart Pen pad, it automatically syncs into Evernote, so I don't have to do anything. The most reliable way is to probably have a pen and take photographs, and we do that of whiteboards. I do that in my notebook when I'm doing things when I don't have access to the Smart Pen. But when I have access to the Smart Pen, I will use that, because even if the Smart Pen doesn't sync properly, I can still take a photograph of it and feed it in. But I didn't have to do any work. I drew my diagrams, my notes, and it automatically syncs into Evernote. So you can see what I've done here. I've explored the state of the context. It's not a big state model, but I can go from active to hidden to closed, and I can do that in a variety of ways. And I've marked down the constraint, like that I cannot move, or I should not be able to move, to closed if the context has open actions. And I made a note there that I only did it with one open action. Really, it's multiple open actions. So I really need to expand the scope to be greater than or equal to 1. So I've got a bigger set of things in there. What I'm also conscious of is I really only did the switch from trying to move from active to closed. I didn't move from hidden to closed and see if that makes a difference. So I have to explore the moving into closed states to check that constraint. But even that's not going to be enough, because the context here is related to actions. So I really have to explore actions in relation to this. And actions can have their own state model, so they can be open or closed. That seems to be what's important for this particular constraint. Actions have other states or attributes. They can be starred, not starred. They can be dependent on others or not dependent on others. So what I've done is I've tried to make notes on that using a crude entity life history model. So these are not like formal diagrams. You could probably model these in formal tools, but I'm not using them in completely formal. I'm using them as the concept of there are states when we switch between them. There may well be, in theory, there's more states in context because it's being edited. There's other things that are going through in the messaging, but I'm not modeling that at this point. So I thought through, well, what is the actual life cycle of the context? So I can create it. When I create it, it's in active mode. It's alive as a context, i.e. it's been created and it's not deleted. So I've called that live. Then I can do multiple things. That's an iteration symbol. I can do multiple things at different times. I can make it active. I can make it hidden. I can make it closed. I can do other things. I can edit it. Edit the details, but I haven't represented that in here. This is a model. It doesn't include everything. Then I'm aware that, well, there's a dependency between the actions. So I can add actions to a context, either moving them in or editing the action to be part of the context or creating the action to be part of there. I can delete actions from the context. I can move them out. I can have repeated actions that will add on to the context. So I really have to explore that, because that is related to the context. And I really have to explore that with all the different states that the context can be in. And I've got a fairly good set of coverage then if I do that. But then if I look at the action itself, I can create an action, and an action has to be part of a context when I do. So I've got a reference there to remind me there's a relationship between the state when I create this. So I should really create an action for an active context, create an action for hidden context, create an action for closed context. I should do those combinations. Then I'm thinking, well, I need to amend the actions. What does an amend mean? And I haven't represented in here that I can amend the text or the due date or anything like that, because that doesn't seem relevant to the part of the system that I'm exploring. So I'm deliberately excluding parts, but it's obvious what I'm excluding because it's not in my model here. So I can star something. I don't know if that's important or not, but it might be. So I put it in there. I can change the context. I can go into the action and amend it and change the context, which essentially is starting to relate what happens to an action with what happens to a context over here. When I change the context for an action, it deletes it from one of the contexts over here. So these events are related. So I can close an action, I can open it, and you can see that that's represented as the action state, because I'm interested in the action state, but that's an event. I can open it or close it. The event then causes a state change, and I'm really only interested in these state changes. So whatever here impacts that state change, I'm modeling as an event. Then I'm also thinking, well, does it matter if I try and have dependencies on action, right? Because this just says context can't be closed if it has multiple open actions. What if it's an closed action that is dependent on something else? Can I do that? Can I have that? I don't know. So I'm putting in here, I want to try and explore the dependencies at this point as well. So that's what this rough model is. And it's well, this is a diagram of the model in my head, because I'm trying to clarify the model in my head. So it's not a set of formal models. I think of these as a state model and an entity life history model, and I'm trying to pull out the events. And the reason I'm pulling out the events is that if I ever want to do any ad hoc or quick automating on this and really have a lot of combinations, I can just have event triggers that say, just explore these different events. We've got a context. When we have a context, have an event that switches it into active. Have an event that adds an action to it. Have an event that explores this. And we can just iterate over all of these. And at some point, and we can make decisions about, well, should we allow this? Should we not? Or I can review the event sequences that come through and see when a message came across and when it didn't. So I've got a lot of scope for this, but thinking it through this way really helped, because what I was then able to do was then start make a decision about what to do next. So this is essentially the results of a modeling session, which then feeds into a planning session. And my plan is very simple. And again, I did this in the notepad because I'm still working on that model, because I don't know whether this is complete or not. So what I've done is I've identified the things that I think are most important to explore. So you can see also that the names that I'm giving these sessions are not like fixed in stone. They're not. So it's not like you have to do a modeling session, then a planning session. It's the main aim for that previous session was a modeling session, which fed into a planning session. But the planning session was so small, right, 2 minutes, I didn't track it as a separate session. So I've included that in the modeling session. So I'm being flexible about how I model this. It's really important that when we model our processes, we're flexible about it, because otherwise we're going to get hung up on, did I do this properly? Did I do this formally? Am I doing this the same way that so-and-so does this? And we never want to get hung up on those things. We want to get hung up on being effective and doing the right things. So here I've identified what I believe are the most important things to explore next. If I was working on a project, I would discuss this. I would then agree this, but I'm not. So I'm making the decision myself. So I'm thinking the most important things are, we'll put a context in a closed state and then try and do these things to it, right? Try and have an action event, so I can create an action event on something that's closed, create a normal action event, and create a repeat action event on there. So I'm trying to go through. And I'm also aware that I need to explore the action state, but action state isn't relevant to created because it's always created in an open state. But then I'm also thinking, well, I want to change the context. So if it's an action that's on a closed context, I'm going to want to change the context, possibly move it to another one that's closed, another one that's open. And is the action itself going to be open or closed? Well, the only ones that's really important is open. So here I'll probably explore an open action which is on a closed context because I know how to do that, then see if I can move it into an open context, move it into a closed context, and try and move it between these things. And I'm just going to try and explore this model. This would be my rough plan for doing that. And I would probably won't go further than this in a planning session. If it was an agile project and I didn't have time to do this straight away, then I would probably spend time planning this out. If the functionality wasn't ready yet, then I might spend time planning this out in more detail and writing down exactly context and closed state, create an action, context and closed state, create a repeating action against that context and closed state, take one of the actions on it and try and change the context and move it on to another closed state. So I would expand that at this point. Because that's the planning is as in-depth as you need it to be, to either remind you what you're going to do next, to plan it so that someone else can do it, to plan it so you can communicate it so that people can say no and review it. Planning is supporting communication, and it's supporting helping you think about what it is your next steps are. It's helping you estimate how much time am I going to spend on this, am I going to have to do going forward. So I combined two things into a rough plan because my assumption is that I'll just go straight away and do this. If for some reason I don't get to go straight away and do this, I can come back later and expand this, right? Because it will remind me what is going on. It's clear enough to help me. So that was a modeling / planning session to help me get my head around what I need to do. And also I'm aware now the amount of complexity and relationships in here. And I haven't included projects in here. I haven't looked to see whether a project state is related to this. I'm also conscious that this is very informal. So there's a risk that I might not have explored the complexity possible. There might be a better way of modeling this such that I could use techniques. Maybe there's an actual event modeling diagramming approach that I can use to help me understand this, and then maybe there's different ways of covering that automatically that just aren't springing into my head at the moment. Maybe there's a tool that I can use to model events and have it come through. Maybe I could feed this into GraphWalker and have it pull out the states properly. Maybe I can combine multiple graphs in GraphWalker and model it that way. Because maybe I don't have to use it to actually automate, but maybe I can use it to generate hints that I will follow. Right, so there's possible options around tooling here because I'm starting to think this through in a more formal way. But modeling, planning, and the tools that I've used are text tools all the time, but I've added in a little bit more technology. So this is a smart pen so that I don't have to take photographs of it and tidy them up and put them in my notes. And I'll see what I do next. So after the Recon session, it was clear that while I understood roughly what was going on, I really needed to model it to be able to approach it from an effective coverage position. Different phases feed into debriefs where I decide what I'm going to do, go back to planning and go, right now I'm going to focus on modeling to work out how best to cover this, and it all feeds in. The different sessions feed into each other because we're gaining more information and understanding about what we're doing. So this is the note that I made in my earlier session, the Recon session. I needed to prep a more comprehensive coverage approach because I didn't test this, right? Test is in quotes because what does test mean? But I'm aware that I kind of did a cursory overview of it. So I did an initial basic exploration, but I didn't really track what I did. I didn't really make decisions about this state followed by this state. So it was a bit ad hoc. I may not have effectively taken notes on the coverage. I could probably extract that out of the session, but it was easier just to go, right, let's just do this properly. Let's think this through. Let's model this and get a good understanding. Rather than dive straight into a diagramming tool, and there are loads of very good diagramming tools, I instead decided to draw it. And here I'm using a
a smart pen. So it's a LiveScribe Ager pen, which means that when I draw on a notebook, it automatically updates in Evernote. So I've always got an image of what I'm doing. The pens can have issues. I had to resend off for a new one because my pen broke, but when they work, they are fantastic. And so this was 2 days ago. I got a new pen, which was just in time for this, so I used that. If I didn't have a smart pen, I would write it down in a bit of paper and take a photograph of it. And I've written scripts over the years, I think some are in GitHub, which use ImageMagick to straighten images and make them black and white and get rid of all background and other stuff. And I've used that on whiteboards. And there's actual tools you can use and buy where you take a whiteboard photo and it will get rid of the background, straighten it up, make it look nicer. But the point is, we don't need expensive tools. We just need something that supports us thinking through the problem. And I make the distinction between modeling and creating a representation of that model. So what I'm doing here is, whilst it looks like I'm drawing diagrams, what I'm doing is I'm modeling the entities, the states, the relationships. I'm trying to get that in my head. What I've got on paper is a representation of what is in my head. What you can see here is something that I would interpret. It doesn't have all the bits of information. It doesn't have everything that's in my model. There's no screenshots there. There's nothing about the actual fields that are on a context. All of those are in my model, which are in my head. But I'm making a diagrammatic representation, which allows me to zoom in on some of those aspects. What I'm interested in modeling here is the state transitions, the constraints, and the relationships between the different entities. And I'm concentrating on 2 entities here, which are the action and the context. I'm ignoring projects. So as you have an understanding of state transition diagrams, entity life history diagrams, flow diagrams, sequence diagrams, all the formal types of diagrammings you can have. And then once you've got that understanding, throw it away so that you can model informally as you require. The formal models are really good when you're working with tools that will then do something with them. Right? A formal state transition diagram is really great when you're working with a tool like GraphWalker, which can then interpret your state transition model and automate the application for you from that model. Formal models are great when they have tool support that will do something beyond creating a diagram. Diagrams are there to be interpreted into supporting someone else's modeling process. So with this, modeling is a fundamental skill with testing. And when people are often not aware that they're modeling all the time, right? Everything that we see, observe, learn, that goes into a model in our heads. So very often we talk about intrinsic models, internal models, mental models. It doesn't matter. All models are mental models. What we do is we create diagrammatic representations or communications of those to help us focus or to help other people understand what we're doing. I knew I had to do a modeling process because the model that I had after doing the Recon session was ambiguous. It wasn't clear. So I needed to do a modeling process to get clearer so that I could understand what I was doing so that I could build scope for going forward. Very, very simple concepts can expand into very complex models. Not complicated models, but complex models, rich models, models that have a high degree of interaction, a lot of combinations. Now, the benefit of formal models is that they have tool support. So you have state transition diagrammers that will help you create very exact state transition diagrams that are exact to the spec that can then be interpreted by other tools. We don't need to use those. It's very useful to have a grounding in those so that we understand what we're doing and we understand the different perspectives that we can create when we're drawing diagrams. We can look at state, we can look at the life histories, we look at entities, we can look at attributes, we can look at relationships, we can look at flows, we can look at data flows, we can model the data. There's a whole bunch of different diagramming approaches that can support us in that formal modeling. But too often I see people jumping to a tool. What we really need is some way of supporting us with our modeling. So I use pen and paper, sometimes just a camera and I'll capture that, copy that from wherever the photograph is stored into Evernote. I've done consultancy reports which have appendices which are just diagrams drawn on paper or on whiteboards. I think it's important to just capture and provide and then interpret around it. So if I do need to create diagrams, I'll use something like draw.io. That's where I created the diagram that you're seeing in this set of slides. Draw.io is free. You can download a desktop version. I find it quite useful. If I'm wanting a code-based solution, I'll use GraphViz, which uses a domain-specific language for creating diagrams. And there's a whole bunch of text to image diagramming tools that I sometimes use as well. But I don't necessarily need to use complicated tools. The days where we would buy the pro version of Visio and script it have gone now. There's so many options open for creating diagrams, but I still rely on pen and paper when I want to try and think through the problem and change it before codifying it for more formal communication processes in an actual diagram. But the modeling process, it's that modeling session to actually spend time getting your head straight is really important, and that will lead on to planning sessions. So another planning session, having modeled these states, I then want to plan what I'm going to do next. And I kind of bled those two sessions together because the modeling session was maybe, 40 minutes, and then the planning was just a quick plan, diagrammatic, drawn on paper, which took about 5 minutes. So I didn't really track that separately, but it is the concept of a planning session. And this was it. This was what I planned. This was my plan. So I've identified the most important areas to explore, which is some states and some state transitions. Then I'm looking at the events that an action can undergo, and then I'll try and map the states to the actions, and I'll explore this as a model. So that's my quick plan. Now, if this was a real project, what I would be doing is I would be adding these as notes in a Jira task or making them visible, because we may not do them immediately. Putting it on a Kanban board, discussing the ideas with a team. If I wasn't doing it immediately, then I may need to track this better, expand it a little bit further so I don't forget my thoughts. A lot of our planning is related to how quickly we're going to implement that plan. How detailed do we plan? It's how quickly we're going to do it. If we're not going to do it immediately and we think we're going to forget, but it's important, we've got live ideas, we may go into it into more depth as a plan now. But if we're going to do it immediately, we may plan on the fly. So it depends how exploratory our project is going to be. So one of the things to point out is that modeling and planning are so related, because when we have a model and when we have a relatively formal model, that can be used for coverage. So planning is really prioritizing parts of our model coverage. So I have a model there, which is a diagram with the state transitions, and I'm going to cover those state transitions when I do my testing. It's going to be a coverage approach. Having a representation of the model from a specific perspective, state, life history, hierarchy, flows, events, just makes it easier to see. It makes it easier to see what coverage we're going to do now and what we might have to leave until later, right? Because an initial plan will help us just focus, which allows us to maximize the effectiveness of our testing. And we only, this is key, we expand our plan only as far as we need to support the next session. One of the issues we had with old-fashioned structured testing is that we planned too far. Right? We planned in so much depth, we would spend months planning and create more plan than we had ever got time to implement. And then you'd have to go through planning sessions to scope down and deprioritize. And it was a mess. It was just a huge waste. Right? But that was what we did. But we over-planned. What we want to do is plan effectively, which means minimal planning to support us in the next step. And my next step is going to be a coverage session based on that
simple plan, which means I'll have to expand that plan in my coverage session. So I've got the concept of a coverage session, and a coverage session for me is when I have a relatively well-defined model and a formal representation of that model, and my aim is to cover it. That's a coverage session because I'm focused on working through the steps. And a coverage session could be as simple as, here are a list of acceptance criteria. Check whether all these acceptance criteria have been met. Here is a mind map of areas. Check that all these areas exist. Here is a list of status codes. Check that the API returns these status codes. Right? I'm covering a specific set of things. So a coverage session is the first real session in this entire exercise that is actually testing. Right? All the rest have been investigating, modeling. I've learned things. I've found defects. I've got notes. There's communication. But this is the actual formal testing session. And if I wasn't splitting all of this into sessions, all the previous work would be invisible. Right? People wouldn't know it was happening. There would be less notes for it. It would just be me doing stuff. Now, I thought that the diagram that I created in the modeling session was a little bit weak to support a coverage session, so I created a mind map to expand it. Did the normal thing as I'm doing the coverage session. I keep notes. I actually found missing items from my plan and added them into my notes, which is what you expect, right? Because we're doing minimal planning. As we go through the testing, we learn more, we adjust our plan. Some things we do immediately because they feed directly into the plan. Some things we put off until later. But one of the key things for a coverage session is that I'm trying to keep additional exploration to a minimum. So I'm trying to really focus in on the coverage. I will still be doing observation. I may do a lot of interrogation, but I'm going to try and not go too far outside the coverage scope. So I'm using the coverage as a constraint to really zoom in on that area. So this is my expanded plan. So I went from a very rough text model into a hierarchy. Now a lot of people look at this and go, well, it's a mind map. Well, it's a mind map tool, but it's really a hierarchy. So I've got the context closed, then I've got the things that I'm going to do for that closed context. Now my initial thought was, all these different action events I would use during the state transition process as well, going from closed to open. But it didn't fit. So you can see that I've expanded my plan out. So it's very clear what I'm going to cover. It's very clear that I'm not going to look at dependencies at this point in time. So I can come back and look at that later. And I'm going to repeat some of the testing for the open and the hidden. So I think it's clear there what I'm going to do. And it's a very simple diagram, but it's very, very tight. And I can work through that for my actual coverage session. So as I make notes, you can see that the headings that come through are actually related to the mind map. I'm just going through mind map branch by branch and doing testing and making notes as I go through. And you'll see the notes in more detail during the debrief session. But having this degree of coverage was useful because it allowed me to explore that relationship between the moving the context state and the actions. So it became very obvious that there is a constraint that you can't close a context when it has open actions, but it's possible to add an open action to a closed context. It's possible to have an action on an open context and amend the action so that it's moved to a closed context. Now, the constraint isn't enforced in all the different combinations it might expect, but having that model that shows the combinations is what I was exploring to allow me to see that in real depth. So I've just finished an actual test session. This is the first session really where I've done like what you might call proper testing. Because what I did is I took the plan that I had where I'd prioritized what I was going to do, and what I was going to cover, the different states. And because I'm about to act on it, I expanded it out into a form that I can follow. And I'm calling this a coverage session because I'm going to stick as much as possible to the model that I'm using to drive this particular session. And it's a coverage model. So to represent this, I put it in a mind map and just expanded out the states. So this mind map here represents this. I've got the context.closed. I want to create an action from the home page via repeated action, and I've just expanded these things out. And you can also see that as I did it, my initial thoughts were I'll do the context open.close, the different action events. But when I actually come plan it, I discover, well, the open closed switch is really only for open actions or repeated actions. And I can't really do it for repeated actions quite easily, but there are repeated actions there. So I didn't have to do it with the action.close because you can't have this multiple states happening at the same time for a single user. It might be possible to do that with multiple users, but the timing could be quite hard. So I didn't try and explore that. So my initial plan expanded into this, and it's not quite as large as I was anticipating. But remember, I haven't covered all the relationships that were in place on the previous diagram covering all my thoughts. But it's a coverage session because my aim is to cover this. I'm going to work through each one of these things, and I'm still exploring because I'm observing and I'm keep paying attention to what happens. In fact, as I was performing the testing, I noticed there were opportunities for additional testing that were not on this coverage plan, so I followed those up. I didn't go too far because it's a coverage session, and had I seen anything else I want to do, I would have made notes. So here are my notes. You see, with my notes in this session, there's a lot more evidence. Right? I've taken a lot more screenshots as I've gone through because I'm actually testing. I actually want to gather evidence as I go through. So I need tools that support me in that evidence gathering in a way that is fairly seamless. So snag it, hit a shortcut key, take screenshot and paste it in. I might use Cloud App, take screenshot, then it automatically creates a URL and I paste it in, and then I can see the screenshots afterwards. But because I'm making my notes in Evernote, it's as easy to copy it from Snagit as it is in here. It also makes the notes pretty simple and easy to read because you can see where I've been, what I'm switching, what I'm doing. So one of the interesting things is I wasn't sure I was actually going to be able to test the repeated actions. The repeated actions are in the system. I go in and I create a repeating to do. Then I have to add a new recurring action, and I choose the context. I want it to be on the closed one, but because you have to set the occurrence and it starts in the future, I wasn't sure this was going to happen. But I experimented. What I did is I set one into the past, and then when I actually went into the context, I saw that the repeated action had been added. So I was able to test the repeated action, and repeated actions were added into a closed context as well. And then I just went through the different combinations I identified, making notes as I went as to which context I was working with, taking the screenshots to see the evidence. And all of this will help me later on when I review this. And the actual taking evidence and making notes doesn't add an awful lot more to the session time, but it does add an awful lot more to the authority that your session has when you're debriefing or explaining or showing it to people or uploading it into the tracking system that you're using. All that extra evidence just adds more weight to the fact that you are doing thorough testing. There were a couple of new paths that I found as I was going through, because remember, the plan is not necessarily guaranteed to be complete. It is a more expanded plan than I had at the start. So I've gone from something very basic to something bigger. And then as I went through, I saw paths that were new because I hadn't considered moving from the hidden to closed. Well, I mean, I had in the initial diagram, but I forgot to add it into this plan, so I've added it there. I hadn't realized that deferred might have an option here, because when you click the drop down, there's an item to defer a to-do. So should I be able to defer a to-do on a closed context and push it off to tomorrow so I get a reminder for some context that's actually closed? Don't know, but I tried that and I can. So I will get a reminder tomorrow in contexts that are closed. So we've explored fairly thoroughly, or have I? I don't know, but we can certainly review the coverage to determine whether it's thorough or not and make a decision as a project. I feel it's fairly thorough. It's probably more thorough than the actual investigation warrants, but I don't have anyone to ask a question to. And part of the reason, if this was a real project and I was following an assumption like this, as far as I have done here, this would probably be a mistake. Because we might discover, well, no, it's perfectly valid to make all these state changes on a context that is closed. The only thing we're stopping is creating a new context on a closed state. You can amend it and change it and do whatever else you want to get it on a closed state, but all we've really decided is when you create a new one, it can't be on a closed state. That's what closed context state means. And if that was the answer, that would be fine. We'd live with that as a project if that was the decision that the project has made and that's how the story is being implemented. We might flag that might be confusing to people and it might not give the constraints they want, but the project decision is kind of what we go along with, and there's no real bug here. It's not crashing the system. It's not a massive impact on anything that the user is going to do, so we can let it ride. It's just we're investigating it, and I'm pushing it further to try and see what I learn about my test process. So my aim is slightly different than as if I was on a proper project. And I've made notes of the additional coverage items that weren't actually on the real plan. So this is probably the first real testing that we've done, which is interesting, right? We've spent quite a lot of time, but I haven't really done any testing up until this point. And the testing also wasn't particularly exploratory. I mean, I've planned it 3 times. In advance, or in a model, then in advance in the handwritten notes, then in a mind map, and then I adjusted the plan as I went through. But the whole notion of exploratory testing is that we're planning and executing at the same time and expanding the plan. What I have to be careful about is when I find things that are far off plan, that I don't necessarily follow them immediately. Sometimes I might, if it looks really serious or the risk looks high. But in my notes, whenever I do that, I will make a note that I've gone off track, and I'll put the timestamp in. If I have an idea that looks like it would take me off track and I don't want to follow it, I will make a note in my notes for something to do later on and pick that up in a debrief. And I've gathered a lot of evidence because it's an actual testing session. I think it's really key in exploratory testing to spend more time explaining what you did and having the evidence for that than necessarily planning in advance. But the planning in advance is important when it's a relatively complicated thing to get your head around, and you want to make sure that you're going to get the coverage that's going to help you. But what I haven't done is I didn't make my notes in my mind map. Right? Some people use mind maps to make their notes in it. I don't tend to work that way, simply because I like to have linear notes. I like to keep things running based on the timestamps and have it work that way. And at this point, I still haven't really done exploratory testing, loose testing, following ideas as we're going through, generating a lot of paths based on the observations that I'm making in the system. So we're still early in the testing phase. Like if I jump straight into an exploratory session, I may not add value into the project because the project has no data on what it's expecting the system to do. So sometimes we start with the acceptance criteria. This is my notion of the expanded form of the acceptance criteria. When I'm comfortable that this works or doesn't work, then I might move more deeply into more
technical observation, exploratory testing, and following the work through. But that's why this is different. That's why the notion is it's a coverage session, because I'm covering a predefined scope fairly tightly. So the only other tool I've really added in here is the mind map tool to support me with visual planning, so that I can think through in advance what I'm doing. And clearly there could be other tools that I could use to do that. And you haven't seen a lot of formal test techniques in here, but what we're doing is we're exploring states, combinations, paths. We're doing all of that kind of inherently, but we're still working essentially from an acceptance criteria point of view, and this really represents combinations of what I feel are acceptance criteria for this story. We go beyond the acceptance criteria when we start doing exploratory testing in more detail. So the notes for the coverage session are pretty thorough. There's a lot more notes. I've gathered much more evidence during testing than I do during Recon. But the Recon's actually good practice, because then I know what tools I need to support me during the actual testing session. So I'm ready with my screenshot tool. I'm ready with a way of using Evernote to document it. And I tend to use FreePlane. A lot of people use Xmind for their outlining or mind mapping tool. I use FreePlane because it has a built-in scripting language, and I value flexibility and supporting me in more ways than I do necessarily aesthetics. Xmind does not have scripting capabilities. It does not have an API. In order to use Xmind, I would have to export it into a certain file format, then write code that will then read that file, parse it, and do things, which I could do, but I don't need any of that boilerplate stuff with FreePlane because I'm working in the model. I'm scripting it in the diagram itself. So people prefer tools for different reasons, but I like FreePlane or FreeMind because it has built-in scripting and is more flexible for me. Now, plans may not be complete. Plans are unlikely to be complete because we won't have thought through everything. So we have to be aware of new opportunities to follow. Now, with a coverage session, I follow them if they are within the scope of the coverage, if they are areas that I missed in the planning. If it's more out of scope idea, then I'm unlikely to follow it. I'm likely to add it down as a note or a to-do or an idea and feed it into a planning session via a debrief. But what I do is I keep notes of the extra things that I do, so it's obvious in my notes for the debrief that we expanded the plan. Because I plan in advance, I know roughly what I want to do, so I know what tooling I need. I didn't really need any extra tools for this type of testing, but I did have to bring in extra tools to support my planning. Like I brought in FreePlane to support my planning. And over time, you'll add to the tooling on your projects to support the actual processes and approaches that you're taking. But a coverage session is an exploratory testing session that has a very tight charter, which is do this coverage, with less permission almost to explore or go off piste. It's very important that we rein it in at that point. So I should really talk about issues a little bit, simply because if this is a real project, I would be doing more about the issues and the defects, but you're not really seeing that here because this is a very small example. So I've made notes, but I haven't really followed them up. So I have seen in the system that there is supposed to be the ability to move a context into a closed state. There's a constraint where we should not be able to move a context into a closed state when it has open actions. But I can add an action to a closed context when I amend the action. I cannot
create an action on a closed context, but the drop down shows me the closed context, so perhaps it shouldn't. So I've got ways of bypassing the constraint, and there are functionality in the tool itself that lets me hit that constraint more easily, right? I can try to add an action onto a closed context. If that constraint was really important, perhaps that shouldn't even be an option. So these are the kind of things that I would probably want to discuss or raise on a real project, but I don't know if it's a real issue here because it's an open source project, it works fine. I don't know what their intent was behind the requirement, but what I do know is that on a real project, I would not have pursued this as far, right? Because I used essentially that issue as the reason why I did the state transition testing, the reason why I combined it with the action in more detail. I think that's an important combination, but if it's a real project, I might not have done that as early, and I might not have explored it as thoroughly because we may not have felt that that was an important combination or relationship. So if this is an issue, when would it be found? Right. So if it was a traditional structured or process where we're writing test cases, scripts, or whatever else, hopefully, when we're analyzing whatever requirements or documents and we're writing our test cases and conditions, hopefully we would have found it then. Hopefully we would have asked questions then. We would have gained clarification. The issue with that process is it might take weeks or days or months to get to that point. Very often in those kind of projects, you would track all your questions and then every couple of weeks have a meeting to clarify questions. But you'd be working on those assumptions, so you'd have a lot of waste and rework. So one of the issues with a very tight scripted process is that these kind of problems can take a long time to find. Someone has to go away, get the answer. Then there's a big discussion in a meeting. Should we do this? Then someone has to bring in the designers and the analysts, and it can take a long time to get this stuff fixed. But that QA and clarification process is essentially an exploratory process. Asking questions, thinking through possibilities, that's an exploratory process. We do exploration during traditional structured test case, test scripting type processes. It's just that it's in advance and there's a lot of scope for waste. If it was an agile project, then hopefully we would have found it during a story grooming session, or when the story is pitched to the team, we would ask questions about it. If not, then would it be found in an acceptance criteria? Well, probably not, because we didn't ask the question, so we don't necessarily know that one of the acceptance criteria is the closed context should not be shown in the list of contexts when creating an action. Unless someone prompted that by thinking it through, maybe the product owner, someone did an exploratory thinking process, a modeling process to work out the implication of what they're doing. But again, it's an exploratory process. This is one of the keys to doing exploratory testing, understanding that. Exploratory testing doesn't just mean when we're hands-on at the keyboard. It's the whole notion of exploring the models, the requirements, the interactions, the processes, how we're building things, the technology we're using, all of this. That is where we explore, and that's how we find things early. But we have to be working in projects that believe that that is suitable. Now, ultimately, projects make decisions about defects. Right? To me, this seems like a mismatch in strengths. If we have a constraint and it's too easy to bypass, then it's almost a worthless constraint, because it only triggers at one point or 2 points. When I try and create an action on a closed one, it says no, but I should just not give people the option. When I try and move a state to closed when it has open actions, that's valid. But then why don't I have the same thing when I try and change an action to move on to a closed context? Surely I should receive the same constraint. We're not enforcing it enough. The project would have to decide whether this is a problem. For me, in terms of the impact on the system reliability, the robustness, the data integrity, none of that matters. The system was not built with this constraint in mind, so this has been added later. So we might not push hard on this if the user decides, look, I just want to stop moving a context to closed when it has open actions. Right? That's because I keep doing that and it's wrong and it annoys me, so I just want a constraint there. Fine, I just don't want to be able to accidentally add an action to a closed context. So we put that in. That's fine, right? Projects make decisions about what is a defect and what is not. We have to be very careful when we're advocating for stuff that we're actually fighting the right battles. It's not an easy thing to resolve, but all of this requires an exploratory process to investigate whether the things that we've found are actually defects or not. And we do that as a team, we do that as a project. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about tooling. I mean, I know when I do this session as a conference talk, people are going to be much more interested in, well, what tools did I use? And I know that I'm going to be disappointing them, because for me, the important thing is, what are all the processes? What are the thinking approaches that we use? Tooling is just something that we use to support the testing. But what's key about tooling is, well, what actually drives it? So for me, what drives my choice of tooling is I need to be able to observe the system. I need to be able to see what's happening. I need to be able to monitor and receive alerts. That's what observation means for me. I need to be able to interrogate, which means stopping what I'm doing with testing, then specifically targeting an area of the system and interrogating the data that's there, or looking back through the previous logs and interrogating it for more information. Observation is something that happens at the same time as testing. Interrogation is something that I have to pause my testing in order to go and do. Manipulation is where I change the data, where I create inputs for the system. Can I manipulate the HTTP traffic? So I'll create something at the GUI, breakpoint the traffic, change the traffic to try and bypass the GUI validation and see if the server can handle it. Can I manipulate this at an API level? Can I manipulate this at a database level? I need tools in order to do more than just work with the graphical user interface. And then I have all the tooling that I need for my admin support. And there's very often more tooling here than anywhere else. So I need tools for my process, like tracking my tasks, recording my time, gathering the evidence, taking screenshots. Where am I going to put this? Is it under version control? How am I going to take my notes? How am I going to draw my models? All of these admin type aspects are what's going to drive my tooling. So observation is seeing stuff in real time, where I'll be doing some testing with a proxy open and I'll see the traffic. So I'll see whether there's any status codes that are not what I expect. That's observing and seeing in real time, which allows me to take action, to quickly catch issues, JavaScript errors appearing in the console. Observation is what supports monitoring. We can't monitor unless we can observe. Observation is key to creating alerts. If there's any errors in a log, or if one of the servers goes down as we're testing, we have something in the background using the observation approach to monitor and alert us. So interrogation is deep dives after doing something. So perhaps I observed something, then I pause and I interrogate the observation in more detail. So it could be just seconds after, but it's still after the testing process. It's more, we get more data when we interrogate than we do when we're observing, because when we're observing, we're observing like the GUI and the traffic and a bunch of other things. So there's a lot of information there. But when we're interrogating, we're zooming in and we're seeing all the headers. We would never be able to monitor or observe those manually, but we can interrogate them to see all the headers on a request and see if they're what we expect. Manipulation is our ability to change stuff, which is inputting data, creating values, deleting things, using defaults, static data, repeating requests, using the API, working at the database, SSHing into the box, all of these manipulation aspects. And that's why we need more tools and we need permissions, because technology will limit us in terms of our observation, interrogation, and manipulation, and so will our knowledge, so will our skill sets. And these are the things that are very easy to work on as we are testing applications, because we want to improve our abilities to test the application. Other people want us to improve our abilities to test the application. So I think you rarely receive pushback if you're training yourself on the job to interrogate, observe, and manipulate in more detail, and to learn the technology that the application is using. Now, evidence gathering is absolutely key, so we need a lot of tooling for this. Normally, I put this into my kind of modeling type of, in my MORIM model, the modeling, observation, reflection, interrogation, and manipulation. It's kind of the modeling that this is. But I pulled it out as evidence gathering because a lot of people may not understand the modeling part or may see that as part of a session, whereas evidence gathering is a process that we use in parallel with our testing. So we're recording the observations we make. Now, I was using Evernote for most of the note taking, but very often I'll use that in a text editor. The PDF that you have of my notes was created using Marked, which is a markdown viewer. Very often I'll use Pandoc to generate these things. I use the LiveScribe Ager pen to automatically create the diagrams in Evernote. 2 screen capture tools, Snagit and CloudApp. Snagit mostly for the static images and CloudApp for the animated GIFs. But there's a lot of tools there to support because note-taking and evidence gathering is so important. In the actual testing, later on, I use a proxy tool. And I pick a proxy tool that allows me to save the sessions, again for evidence gathering, to support later interrogation, support later looking at and seeing whether I did the testing that I want. I mean, if you only included tools for evidence gathering, you'll be in a good place to support your communication processes. You may not be in a good place to really go deep into the system, but if you only had tools, then put the tools in your evidence gathering. So in summary to that is, well, what drives tooling? Well, it's the needs of testing, but we have to identify those needs. So I identify it from models of observation, interrogation, manipulation, and modeling. Other people will have different ways of identifying their needs, but they'll probably end up in the same position. So specifically for the web, I can test blind, which means I don't have any way to observe or interrogate, or I can add tooling. And with the web, we have tools out the box, like the dev tools in the browser itself, or proxy tools. Both dev tools and proxy tools support observation and interrogation. I prefer proxy tools because it's a lot easier for me to observe the DOM and the traffic at the same time with a proxy tool, because I can use the dev tools for the DOM and the proxy tools for the traffic. So I have multiple observation points at the same time. In terms of interrogation and manipulation, the proxy tools do that. Some of the dev tools do that, some don't. So I gain consistency cross-browser by using the proxy tools for the HTTP traffic. But one of the keys that we have is that the technology that we use will require different tools. So we have our needs for testing, but then the technology is what really chooses the specific tool that we use to implement those needs. Okay, so back to the testing. So this is an exploratory session. The coverage is essentially an exploratory session. It's very constrained. So I haven't described that as an exploratory session. Really, all our sessions are exploratory. So here what I'm talking about is something where I have much more free reign. And I'm calling that a technical exploratory session because it's really being driven by technology aims, technology constraints. So having done a coverage session, I'm then going to say, all right, well, let's look at this in a bit more detail at a technology level. So when I'm looking at the changing of the state and the context, I want to look at the traffic that's involved, at a much more lower level, to see whether that triggers anything. I don't know what's in there yet. I haven't seen it. So I'm giving myself permission to look more deeply into the system and explore it and push it as we see fit at the time. So this is a real, true, in quotes, exploratory session. I don't really know how long I'm going to spend. I don't know how long it's going to take. I don't really know what I'm going to find out. I'm going to have to extract coverage from this later on in a debrief. I think that's the real difference between an exploratory session and a coverage session. Coverage session, we come in knowing what coverage we're going to try and achieve. Then we might achieve a bit more or we might descope some during the session so the debrief is there. But with a real exploratory session, we may not really know what we're going to cover, so we have to pull that out retrospectively. So it's kind of like a spectrum from complete coverage to complete free reign exploratory. And the closer you are to free reign exploratory, the more debriefing you're going to have to do to pull out the coverage to see what you've done. So the reason that I'm calling this a technical exploratory session is because I'm working specifically at a technical level. An exploratory session might be more about the functionality, the users, how the GUI works. But a technical one is basically saying, I want you to go below the covers. And I need tools for this. I'm going to manipulate at a much lower level. I'm going to resend requests. I'm going to do DOM manipulation to bypass it. Now, the testing can be driven by the technical observations, right? Like, well, what happens if I change that? I look at it in the DOM. I see that it's got a constraint. What happens if I bypass that constraint? What if I remove that constraint? What if I add more fields in? What if I do things that I can't do at the GUI? This is all what I mean by a technical exploratory session, and tools are mandatory at this. I could do exploratory sessions in the GUI without much tooling, but for a technical exploratory session, I absolutely have to have tooling. So the tools I'm using are Firefox. I don't often use Firefox, but I do use Firefox when I'm working with proxies because I have fewer plugins. I don't use Firefox as much. So it's easier for me to configure through a proxy. That's the only reason. I do have a Chrome plugin to help me remove extensions. Let's have a look. This is the Extensity extension, which lets me switch extensions on and off, which is quite handy with Chrome. But because with Chrome I'm often logged into Google, there's a little bit more noise than I have with Firefox. I use the Foxy Proxy plugin to configure it to use that proxy. One of the things I also liked about Firefox is that it didn't use the system proxy. Chrome very often uses the system proxy, IE uses the system proxy. Firefox certainly didn't used to care. Unfortunately, all the browsers are getting closer and closer together because they're all starting to get based on Chromium. I'm using the OWASP Zap proxy because it's completely free, therefore anyone can repeat this type of work. It allows me to observe, interrogate and manipulate an HTTP level. I'm not using any of the security tools, but OWASP Zap proxy also allows me to save the sessions, which I can't do if I'm using Burp. I think you can save the sessions if you use Charles. You have to pay for Charles. So I've used OWASP Zap proxy because it's completely open source for this particular example. I use the Firefox DevTools to interrogate and manipulate at a DOM level, and the proxy is for the HTTP level. I used a text editor to help me view XML, and I used Sublime Text simply because I've got a license for that and it starts up fast. And every time I type in text editor, I'm so used to typing Sublime. So that's why I used that. I could have used Visual Studio Code, the lightweight Visual Studio one, which is my normal default text editor for doing work. But for ad hoc stuff, I end up using Sublime. Snagit for taking screenshots, and Evernote for note taking. Not taking, note taking. Evernote for note taking. So this is what my screen pretty much looks like as I'm doing the technical testing. So I've got the browser on one side with the DOM up so I can see that and observe it, with the proxy on the other side, and then other tools floating around as I need them. And it's a fairly good working environment. I tend to have a large monitor. If I'm working exclusively on the laptop, then I'll set it to a higher resolution than normal to give me more screen real estate. Having multiple monitors is an absolute boon when we're testing, because we can have things that we're observing, things that we want to interrogate in other windows and drop down to them later on, have multiple things to just scan around with. So my basic process was to work in the GUI, observe the impact of what I did in the GUI at an HTTP level, so I can see instantly if JavaScript is being used. So when I was doing the autocomplete for contexts when creating a new action, I could see instantly through the proxy that it was using JavaScript autocompletion to send a message every time I typed a key, because I didn't know how that worked until I had something that let me observe the traffic. I interrogate the traffic after doing something to see what it is, to gain more information, to build a better model of the system and how it works. I might manipulate the traffic, so resend it to repeat the same action, but with some variables changed, because it's faster doing that than it is doing it in the GUI. If I find anything interesting, then I'll try and repeat it in the GUI. And the reason I do that is it's much easier to justify the raising of a defect when you can recreate it through the GUI than it is at an HTTP level. Now, what I find is it's very important to keep an eye on the time when we're doing this, because an exploratory session, you can often get carried away and get so engrossed in it that if you don't keep an eye on it, you might spend too long. It's one of the reasons why people like time boxing and to keep tight rein on the scope of the testing. I didn't time box this, but what I did is I kept timestamps as I was going through, and I could see the progress of time. Essentially, I stopped, not because of time, but because I ran out of value that I thought I could add in this process. So that's a basic overview of how I did the technical exploratory testing. Just finished an exploratory session, which I'm calling a technical exploratory session, which is a kind of subclass of exploratory session. So an exploratory session is we have much more free rein for what we're doing. We'll set up aims and objectives for the session, but we're really being driven by what we observe, by what we learn at the time, whilst trying to keep in line with the focus that we've set. With a technical exploratory session, I have many more tools open. I'm going to be driven much more by the technical information, the HTTP requests, the messages that I'm seeing, rather than the GUI and the functional flow. So it's just a different level of observation that leads me to progress based on slightly different information. So much more technically informed information. That's what I mean by a technical exploratory session. So I'm using Firefox, and I'm using Firefox because I don't really log into Firefox, so there's less traffic when I use it in combination with a proxy. I'm using Foxy Proxy plugin to configure Firefox to point to the proxy. I'm using Zap as my proxy because it's completely open source and allows me to save this session, which some of the tools like Burp Suite, you have to pay for that functionality. And Zap is cross-platform, so when I understand Zap on one platform, I can use it quite easily on another. I'm using the DevTools to help me with the DOM. So essentially, I use the proxy for all the HTTP stuff. I don't jump back and forwards between the network tab. I use the proxy for the network. The proxy is observing, interrogating, and manipulating HTTP requests. The DevTools are for interrogating and manipulating the HTML DOM. So if I want to make changes and come into a context, and then go, okay, so I don't want to submit closed, I want to submit close, then I'll come in here and manipulate it at the DOM level. But I'm much more likely to do that at the HTTP level first. So I come in here and go close, and then that lets me send to bypass the kind of normal GUI messages that are being sent through. So I'm also using Snagit for screenshots. I used a text editor because I wanted to check the results and as an export, and Sublime seemed like the easiest editor that I had installed to use that. It could have been any editor. And I'm using Evernote for my note-taking as before. So this is what it pretty much looks like when I'm testing. I've got my HTTP traffic, I've got my browser, and I've got the DevTools open. These aren't open all the time, right? Because my basic technical approach is I'm working with this. And what's good about the HTTP view is I can see things like, well, this has code completion, this has name completion, and I didn't know whether this was cached or whether it was done by messages to the server, but I can see that as I type this in, messages are being sent to the server, so that I know that these values are not cached. I know that they're coming in, or I'm assuming that they're coming in. So the way I check is by looking at the actual message and looking at the response, and I can see what's coming back. So I can see that the things shown in that are not cached. But interestingly, this is a JSON request. A lot of the requests that are coming back through the XHR requests in tracks are not JSON. They're complete JavaScript with HTML, which again is a slightly different interesting. So we have two different approaches to handling XHR requests, which I find interesting. And it helps build up a better profile of the application in my head. So basically I'm working in the GUI, I'm observing the impact on the HTTP traffic, so I can see whether it's JavaScript or actual HTTP messages. I'll come in, I'll interrogate these in more detail. Basically it means I stop doing what I'm over here, then I'll come into here and choose a message, interrogate it by looking at it, looking at more detail, and I've kind of paused my work to understand a bit more what's going on. If I want to manipulate one of these, say I want to, so this is a post on to-dos, so this is creating a to-do. If I wanted to create another to-do, I would come in here and manipulate the request and send it through. So I'm bypassing the GUI to work at a much more technical level and create it from the HTTP requests. I did learn that when I'm manipulating things in Zap, I really want to work at the text level, because then I can control the ordering and the actual values, because I found when I was working at the table view, I didn't quite get the output messages I was expecting, because this is sorted under alphabetical parameter name here, I think. And this one, I thought I had typed in the value, but I hadn't saved it, so I didn't quite get the result I expected. But working at text, although it's a little bit more clumsy, guarantees that I'm getting the request. So we've always got issues when we've always got the potential for risk when we use extra tools, that the tool itself might get in the way. And when I was using Zap, I had to upgrade the version of Zap here because I hadn't used it for a while, reinstantiate the certificates, load them into Firefox, because the certificate was out of date. So it took me about 20 minutes just to get started, because I was using tools. The tools give me more insight, but there's overhead and potential risks every time we use them. And it's very important that because I'm working at a low level here, I've got way more information than I had before. Like in here, I can see there's a default context name. When I saw this, I went, what is that? And I was hunting through the admin interface to try and find the default context. I couldn't find it. This was the first one that I set up, which I thought was, in fact, it's not even, so that was the first one I set up, but it's been renamed. So the original name is changing over time, but I don't know how to adjust this. I experimented a little bit creating a to-do without a context to see if it used default context. It didn't, so I don't know what this is for. I've now got questions about what these things are, how they are used, what is the impact on the system, is there a potential risk there that I would have to explore in my testing. I wouldn't pick this up from the GUI and get more information at a technical level. So there's interesting things there. I also have to keep an eye on the time, because with a lot more information, it's a lot easier to find way more test ideas, some of which might take me off scope. So I have to be very careful which ones I pursue. So I have to keep an eye on the time very carefully when I'm doing testing at this low level, simply because there's so much more I could be doing, so much more I could be progressing. There's so much more information to read and understand and pull together. And I'm getting a much richer model of the application, which is good, because then that leads on to more testing later on. So I found some issues with Zap in that it wasn't able to save the sessions in all the folders that I wanted. It was a high level folder. I don't know if that's because I'm working on a Mac. I don't know if that's because the operating system has just been upgraded. I don't know. I had to switch off the HUD when I started because it was too much information, and I wanted to reduce the amount of information overload as I was testing. And I'm not used to the HUD in Zap yet. So it's a whole new set of technology that if I had it working, it would possibly distract me. Like the HUD on Zap is here, then okay, then refresh. And now I've got a whole bunch more stuff here. And there's also a risk that this impacts my testing. Last time I tried HUD, it was in beta mode and it crashed my browser, so I switched it off. I'm sure it doesn't crash the browser anymore, but there's a risk. It's extra tooling, and if it's extra stuff that I don't need, then I'm going to switch it off so that it doesn't get in my way. Options, HUD, okay, bye-bye. So I'm going to switch that off to be as clean as possible in my system. I found interesting things that the tracks XHR messages always respond with a 200, even if there's an error. Some of these things are post 200 response error, right? So there's an error in there, but the code response is a 200. So I would probably raise that as a bug, because it's not obvious to me in the GUI that the message has come back as a 200, but it's obvious to me in the HTTP view that the message is a 200, and really we want status codes that trigger that. But this is an internal API. This is not an API that you would use to interact with tracks, because you're expected to use the JSON API, which is a formal API with status codes. So, but this might also suggest that there's two implementations. There's a GUI API implementation and there's a backend API implementation. So perhaps there's some risk there that I need to explore and look into. And I wouldn't know that unless I was investigating this at a HTTP level. And I see a whole bunch of stuff in here that some of which I followed up. Like when I do a post here in the request, I can see that there's a method, and this method is a put, but the HTTP method is a post. So I explored that a little bit to see what interesting things happened, and I'll have a look at my notes in a second. We'll see that. So let's have a look at the notes, because the notes that I take are not really any different when I'm working at this level. I've still got my aims, I've still got the tracking of what I've actually done, I've still got the timestamps, and I do record in here the actual messages and the content that I'm sending through. So even though it's being tracked by the HTTP proxy, I don't necessarily rely on that, right? I rely on my notes because this is what I'm focusing on. This was of interest to me. There's a lot of HTTP messages in here. If I don't have it in here, chances are I didn't really use that to inform my testing. So there may be scope for reviewing this and seeing things that happen later on. And you can see in here, I explored the underscore method being different from the verb, the HTTP verb. And I found it interesting that when I put in a post with a post method, I got a 404, which suggests that this is being used for routing that I did not expect. So I'm not entirely clear in my head how the application hangs together and what's important for routing. So there may be scope for exploring verb and method combinations in here to see what happens, to see if we can bypass validation to be put into different parts of the app. Don't know. So again, it's one of those things that I might want to look at. You saw that when I put through some messages and got an error, we get a 200 in code, and I made a note of that in my notes. I tried putting in context states that are not valid. So I used a closed state instead of closed, and saw a 200 response come back, telling me that the context has been saved. But when I actually went to view it, and because I don't have database access, my tools didn't allow me to observe everything. So I used the application itself as an export to allow me to view the internals to see whether the data on the back end had changed, even if the GUI wasn't reporting that. So I've got limitations in how far I can observe and interrogate with the technology, because even here I'm assuming that the system is not lying to me. I'm not looking directly in the database to see whether the states did change. But it was interesting to see that we get a positive response back when it was actually an error and when nothing was actually changed, but it said that it did save it. So I think there was more exploration possible in there. But one of the interesting things with exploratory testing is because you're so focused on doing and observing and learning, you only really get a feel for the coverage when you debrief. When you step back and look at your notes, you reverse engineer your coverage, rather than following it as you go through. In a real exploratory session, not a real exploratory session, in a session that is prioritizing exploration, then coverage is important, but it's not the main driver. Right, the main driver is the aims that we have and we try and keep on scope, and the observations that we're making, at least when I do it. If I really want coverage to be important, then I stress coverage in my aims, and it's coverage that's really driving me. Whether I still think of it as a true exploratory session, coverage is something that I reverse engineer. Yeah, so I think I've mentioned some of this stuff. Essentially, what I do is I work here, I see the stuff in here, I manipulate in here. Then if I manipulate in here and see something that is interesting, I will then try and see whether I can recreate that manipulation in here, because it's a lot easier to raise defects against things you can do in the GUI than just at an HTTP level. I have raised defects just at an HTTP level when you say, hey, look, I can send this HTTP request and buy this product for £0. Then people take notice of it, regardless of whether you can do that at the GUI or not. So, but I do like to move back to the GUI because it makes it easier for other people to recreate the bugs. If I say send through this request, they have to get a proxy up, they have to come into the GUI. If I say come into the GUI and open the form, inspect it, change the value to X, then hit the submit, then you see the error. That is a lot easier for programmers to deal with. So using tools themselves have risk and impact. So it took me a little while to set up the proxy before I started. That impacted my testing. But I couldn't do the work unless the tool was working. So that was a necessary trade-off and side effect. I have to be very careful when I'm doing this type of testing that I don't get carried away, because there's way more information, there's way more stuff in here. I'm learning an awful lot of things. So I have to keep an eye on the time. Otherwise, these sessions can take longer than they need to. And I have to keep really sure that I'm still keeping on track with value. Is this technical investigation I'm about to do going to add value? So I have to be careful that I don't spend too long investigating the mismatch between the verbs and the method. I just do enough to see, is this interesting for future work? Is there an immediate problem here? But I've got it in my notes so I can revisit it. When I do a debrief on this, then I'll come out with all my to-dos and things after that to know where to go. I try to duplicate bugs at the GUI as well as just at the HTTP level because they're easier to take seriously. And the automated recording here is not my main record. Right, this is a useful source of evidence. I'll save it, we can review it later on, but my main evidence is coming from my logs in Evernote. Where is Evernote gone? There. So this is still my main log. That's why I copy the messages in here, because I thought this was important enough. It's useful to come in here and review it. And because I've got fairly detailed notes on what we did, there's some timestamps. I could look at the 12:23, look at the timestamp in here, and I can be fairly sure that round about this point is what we're talking about in my notes. So I can start working through my notes in combination with this to see what I did. But it's really an after the fact record. It's not my main information source. So that's probably all I should cover with the debrief here. And it's interesting, it's good insight. The most important insight for me was the notion that when I'm focused on coverage, the exploration is constrained within the coverage, and observation and reflection identifies new opportunities, but these don't need to be followed immediately, but it's still very coverage focused. The more that I'm emphasizing exploration, the more the coverage is reverse engineered from my notes, because it's not apparent when I'm working there necessarily what I'm covering on, because there's a flow of consciousness. It's very hard to talk as you're doing exploratory testing, which is why I'm not doing that for this sessions, because if I did, the sessions would be much longer. There wouldn't be as much indicative process for how I actually work as a tester, because I'd be talking and talking things through that would distract from the way that I make my notes. So I've done the testing clean and made my notes, and debriefing afterwards to talk about it that way, as though this is a real debrief sitting with someone. But it's not a proper debrief because I haven't collated out the coverage yet. But that was a good insight for me, the difference between the coverage focus and the exploratory focus, and really hammers home why we need to do debriefs, why we need to come through and summarize our work afterwards, because we just lose that sense of coverage when we're actually working through it. Or at least I do. Maybe your notes and approach may be different. Okay, so I should try and go meta a little bit on the technical exploratory session. And so here's the kind of notes. Again, you'll see this, my normal note taking, top to bottom, it's linear, it's time-based, I'm putting timestamps in, but I'm also adding quite a lot of information about the HTTP request. I see no issue with copy and pasting from my work into my notes. That seems perfectly valid and sensible thing to me to do. I don't really care if my notes get too long. The notes don't have to be uploaded and stored in Jira. They're just text files, so they're very, very light. There will be screenshots. They can be zipped up. There's a whole bunch of different ways of doing this, but anything that I create in my notes is much lighter than if I was doing it in a Word document, or if I was doing it on the system and adding it into a database. If I ever have to work with Jira or any system like that, I never, ever type into the system directly. I always copy and paste from my notes, because there have been too many times when I've written something up, hit save and lost it. Any online system, Gmail, Patreon, LinkedIn, I never type in the system itself. I will always copy and paste from my notes in. That's just Alan's handy paranoid tip for dealing with the real world, because as a tester, things crash under our fingers that don't crash under anyone else's. So I tend to rely on stable technology like text editor. There's so little can go wrong with it, and copy and paste into something else. And if the system says, hey, you're not allowed to paste in here, then that's fine. I will hijack the DOM and send it in, or write it into a clipboard buffer and type it in automatically. I have ways of automating anything. So there's my notes, right? I'm putting in quite a lot of information in there. And the key thing I want to pull out is the URLs that I'm adding in my notes. When I convert them into PDF via Pandoc, they're clickable, right? I'm not formatting. I'm not doing anything special for formatting here. I'm relying on the tools adding formatting later on. These slides that I'm doing are written in just text, and it's a tool called MARP, which converts my markdown text into slides. I don't even format my slides, right? I don't. The aesthetic part of life is not something that I'm really focused on. I'm much more focused on the content and the value. So, what I found. So I found a potential bug in Zap that I wasn't expecting, but I don't know whether that's because I've just upgraded the Mac operating system to this new horror that keeps asking for permissions to save stuff, and perhaps Zap didn't, so I wasn't able to save to subfolders. Don't know. Possible bug in tracks, because when we do things that trigger errors, it's not an error response that comes back. Everything has a 200 status code, and that itself is not an issue, but it's triggers for me the thought process that perhaps Tracks trusts the GUI more than it perhaps should, which would make me nervous if I was running this as a multi-user system on a server, because I would want to make sure that people couldn't mess with it. The XHR messages, the HTTP messages sent by JavaScript, which are error messages, are still a 200 status rather than a 400 status. And there's a lot of stuff that I saw that I found really interesting that I might want to explore later, but didn't really explore in detail now, because there's method types in the forms. So when I post something to Tracks, in the form there's an underscore method equals put in the body of the message, and I'm wondering, how does that differ from the actual HTTP verb? I just find it interesting that it's a difference. It's the kind of thing that I would want to explore on a technical basis. When I'm using the Tracks GUI, it's submitting forms, like post request with encoded form posts. It's not using the API, but I know that Trax has an API. So I'm wondering if the forms API is different from the JSON API, the REST API. So could there be a mismatch there? I haven't explored the API in any way, but seeing this difference makes me think that I need to explore the API around this area. I was limited in what I could observe because I didn't include any database tools in order to check whether the system was actually not changing data, because it was telling every time I changed something, it was saying, yes, I've made this change, and it shouldn't have been. So I wanted to double check that it wasn't actually making the change. Like when I was putting a context into an invalid state, it would happily go, yes, I have made your change. But it didn't actually persist that change. But the way I checked that was by doing an XML export of the data. But I still don't know whether that's in the database or not. I assume the system is accurately reporting what it's exporting from the database and not from a cache. But I can't check that myself. I can't convince myself completely of that because I don't have any way of accessing the database at this point in time. The tools that I did use automatically record an HTTP session, which is great. I've got all the logs, all the messages that I sent. I can easily replay HTTP messages. It's easy for me to see the traffic separately from the dev tools, so I can use the dev tools exclusively for DOM inspection, and I can use the proxy exclusively for HTTP. In terms of lessons, like tools can impose a risk. Right. Every tool that we add imposes some sort of risk in terms of time to learn. Maybe it crashes, maybe there's bugs in that tool. I lost time using Zap because I hadn't used it for a while, so I had to set up the certificates, had to make sure it was working on Mac, had to try and get it upgraded to the latest version. So it cost me some time. And that's the kind of minimal impact that tool has just in terms of startup. When we're doing this kind of technical sessions, we have more information than we can handle and investigate at that point in time. So there's much more risk of going off charter or taking up too much time. So we have to be very careful about that. One of the good things about pairing on testing is that there's less risk of going off charter and there's less risk of going off time because you've got someone else watching that as well. Some test ideas are not possible without tooling. Right? I was able to submit a form with multiple fields in it that would not be possible without tooling. So I was really trying to stress the back end. I can't possibly do that without tooling. I do make sure that I duplicate bugs at the GUI as well as HTTP just to make it easier to justify or advocate for them. And even though the proxy is storing all the traffic, I still copy HTTP requests and URLs into my notes because in my notes, they have much more weight. I'm saying this specific thing is important and I rely on my notes as evidence. I rely on the session recording in the HTTP traffic as a useful side effect that may be useful in the future, but my notes are my essential evidence that I really want to focus in on. So what did I not do? Well, there was so many things I didn't do. I mean, I haven't used the API yet. I haven't checked state transitions in API. This is such a tiny amount of testing over like 4 hours. But things that I really didn't do in here, I didn't do any automating, right? If I was doing automating, that would be planned separately, probably not even as an exploratory session, because automating is most usually a strategic activity. Therefore, it's likely to be a story level task that we automate the acceptance criteria, not likely to be tracked as a session. If it was tactical automating to support the testing, then it would probably be a session, right? Like a tooling session where I knock up a script to do X. That would be an exploratory session that would get tracked. But automating when it's tactical is when it's strategic is likely to be factored into the project. When I automate, I start tactically. So I start with crude code. It's something that basically just works. It might need some massaging to make possible. Like I might have to debug it because there's no synchronization in place to slow it down. I might have to, but I'm automating with support. Having something that works, I then refactor it to make it reliable, to create abstraction layers that we can use later on. So I start very ad hoc and move into more strategic approaches. I think it's very important that we learn some tools well and just use those as our default. As we move between projects, the default may change, but what we want is tooling that we can use as experts to get value out of quickly. The tools should not be slowing us down. They're there to help us. So I'm unlikely to automate in PHP unless the entire project is PHP, in which case it's strategic. But if I'm automating on a PHP project for myself for tactical reasons, I might well do that in Java because I know that better. So I didn't show any of the admin stuff. None of the admin sessions, none of the uploading my notes into Jira, none of my adding testing tasks, none of the here are my test conditions that I think I'm going to use, adding them in as ideas into this story. I didn't raise any defects. I just had notes that I should raise defects. I didn't have any processes where I went and spoke to the developers and asked clarifying questions. I didn't communicate anything to anyone during this. So, and lessons that I've learned in the past are to try and keep this as lightweight as possible. Very often I'll see teams who they're on agile projects, they're doing agile things, but then suddenly they have test tools, a test tracking system, a test log system, an add-on for tool X that supports the exploratory testing logging. I try and avoid anything like that, particularly on agile projects, because the only people that are ever going to look at a test, in quotes, tool are people on the test side. So no one else, like the scrum masters, the product owners, the programmers, none of them are going to look at the testing stuff. They will look at the testing stuff if it's in the normal tooling, if it's just a task, if it's another story, then people will look at it. So I just try and avoid it because it adds that extra resistance into the collaboration. So you've seen this all the way through, but this is the basic testing flow that I used. Right, I'd plan, even if it was what am I going to do next, and then have an idea. Oh, I better install the software. That would then lead to a session. I try to capture things as sessions because I'm trying to manage my time. So I want to make sure that my aims are as clear as possible and I can do them in 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, half an hour. Right? I want to have very tightly constrained activities because very often in a working environment you'll get interrupted. I mean, when you look through the notes, you'll see that even in my testing, I was interrupted, but I just got interrupted timestamp and then I'm back at work timestamp. So we can still use our logging to handle interruptions. Each of the sessions, either formally or deliberately or informally, will lead to a debrief session, like just a thinking about what I did, taking stock, collating it, tidying it up, uploading it. And that will then lead on to a more formal admin session where I will track the time of, I now have to raise all these defects. I now have to, we have a mandatory process where my logs get uploaded into Jira, and I will do that and I'll track that time. But the main sessions that I used were planning sessions, an environment or an install or setup session, a health check session where I'm making sure that things are right before I move forward, a recon session, like a modeling session to help me understand what I'm doing, a coverage session where I'm constraining my testing to a particular coverage scope, which is different from an exploratory session, which has much more free reign. But then there's different types of exploratory sessions. And remember, these classifications are arbitrary, right? They're me making this up to get a better handle on what I did. This is not what I expect you to communicate. This is not how I expect you to model. But you do this for yourself. I'm just trying to make the distinctions that I thought were important. I could call each one of these just session and I would be fine. But the important point is I know what my objective is and I take stock afterwards. And there's a difference between the actual value work and the admin work, right? The admin work changes based on the environment and the process we're using. These other things are almost context independent, right? I will always have some form of coverage session where I'm tightly constrained. But the admin will vary from project to project, environment to environment, site to site. So take this as a rough flow, mix and match them, do them as you want, do planning, do debrief to check if you're planning, plan some more, then come in and do a coverage session, then jump to an admin session and include your debrief in the admin. I don't really mind. But whatever you do, chunk your work into small chunks and be very focused as you do it. Okay, so as an end summary section, I just want to describe the testing in a bit more detail, go over tooling, bugs, exploration coverage, just try and make some summary distinctions. Now this was interesting to me, right? Of the 4 hours essentially that I spent testing, only 1.5 hours were hands-on, and if this was a real project, there'd be another 2, 3, possibly 4 hours of admin, raising the defects, talking to people, investigating things. So the real point here is that a lot of what we do in testing goes unnoticed and for a lot of people goes untracked. I track it in my daily notes all the time. A lot of people do not track their planning sessions. They do not mark down when they start going to a meeting what was covered. They don't track things, so their time gets lost. I think it's really, really important that we know where our time goes, that we track it in order to be more effective with our use of time, but also to help other people understand what we do. And the more that we can make our testing visible, just the less hassle you get about, are you adding value? Because you're demonstrating, I'm doing these activities, and I'm doing these activities because this is the value that comes out of it. So I encourage you, that's partly why I'm chunking down the work into different sessions, because it justifies the existence. We know the value of a modeling session is to help us think things through and plan it. So because a lot of testing goes unnoticed and untracked, I encourage you to make it noticeable and to make it tracked. So bugs are interesting. If I had found no bugs in tracks, I would be happy, right? Because this exercise for me was about the process that I'm using. But in the real world, bugs are a visible output. And for a lot of people, they're the most important visible output. Where testing itself is a process of deliberate exploration and coverage, finding bugs is simply a side effect, right? We find a bug because we try and cover an area that we thought existed and it doesn't. Or we try and pursue a particular coverage path, but we can't finish it because there's a bug, right? Bugs essentially are a side effect from our testing, exploration and coverage. But bugs are where people put in the time and attention, and they can soak up a lot of time, right? In the exploration, I note down, here's a potential issue. If I have to go and raise that as a bug, that can take me another half hour, an hour, and then it goes through a formal process. So in agile processes, that's why we encourage people, after your session, when you find an issue, go and speak to someone about it and see whether you can pair on them and get it fixed. Sometimes you can't do that because you have to plan to make space for that activity. But if you do, perhaps it's possible to stick it on the board as a bug and then a note of your session. But the less formal we make it, the less time it takes. But some projects, if you find a bug, in order to justify the time for doing it, you have to raise it into Jira and then we have to plan it and discuss it. If that's the process, that's fine. In which case it's very important that we track that time so that people understand how much of our time is spent on admin as opposed to actually testing. So tooling comes from the needs of testing, right? Our need to observe, interrogate, manipulate, do the admin, modeling and evidence gathering processes. That also comes from the technology that we're choosing. And the technology can hinder the tooling. We might be using such advanced technology that the tooling isn't there. We might be using a brand spanking new JavaScript framework that has no debug tools, that has no way of actually working with it, which can impact the testing. Consequently, we then have to rely on our technical knowledge for HTTP, JavaScript, the DOM. It becomes a risk. If we don't have the tooling that supports the technology, we should flag that as a risk and tag it as, because we're doing this, it makes it a lot harder to test because I can't gather the evidence, I can't see the memory usage, I can't observe this, I can't pause it, I can't interrogate, all those things. So it's worth flagging these things up if you're in that situation. So a couple of points on coverage just before we finish, because I made the point that there was a difference between an exploration section and a coverage section in my head. Right now, at all points in our testing, at all points in the activities that we use in testing, we are exploring. We're exploring when we're communicating, when we're asking questions in a story, when we're in meetings trying to clarify things. As we're doing our testing or any activity, we're observing and we're trying to process that and reflect on it so we can identify new opportunities to test or investigate or to-dos or questions to ask. We do not need to follow those immediately. We can add them in our notes and do them later. And we should add them in our notes regardless if we're going to do them immediately or later. But the main difference is when we're focused on coverage, we constrain our exploration within that coverage, and it's a lot easier to understand what we did, and our debriefs are mainly there to go, well, what else did we cover? What did we miss in our initial coverage assessment? And it might be, well, what simply could we not do? What did we have to de-scope? And we might have to do that later. But when we're focused on exploration, the coverage is much less evident. It has to be reverse engineered from our logs, from our evidence, from our notes, because we are so focused on the thinking process, the doing, the working out what we're going to do next, the modeling in our head, the working out, well, what does that mean? What should I do? All the questions. We don't track a summary as we are doing our exploration and testing, or I don't, right? Some people, when they're using mind map tools, try and organize their testing as they go through into chunks and coverage areas. I don't do that because I'm a very linear, time-bound test approach, and I will reverse engineer that later. I mean, it's like when I'm writing. I don't want to edit as I'm writing because I want to concentrate on the flow. And a lot of the material that I create is first draft as a result of that. I'm focused on the flow. Then I do a possibly minor spelling error, but very often I'll just release it, and if I see a spelling error in live, I'll fix it in live. But I don't edit as I'm writing because I'm interrupting my flow, I'm interrupting my modeling, I haven't got a handle on what I'm doing. I'll go back later to edit it, see if it covers everything that I need to add summary points. I think that's the key point. Coverage, it's well defined. We constrain ourselves. Exploration, we have to be careful that we don't go too far off scope, that we don't spend too much time, but we have to do a debrief to work out what we actually did. That's pretty much it. Because this is a case study, I don't really anticipate adding more content to this. Although in theory I could do a live session. The reason I did it this way is that it's very hard to test and describe what you're doing at the same time. What you get is a slightly less representative test session. So every test session that I've done as a demo is not completely representative of the work that I do, because I don't take as many notes because I'm communicating, and rather than communicating via notes, I'm communicating verbally. I tried to avoid doing that in this exercise so that people can see the exact things that I do, the depth to which I make notes, the amount of questions that I add in the documentation. It's really important to see that. And what I'm hoping you'll do is you'll watch some of these videos. You may not watch them all. If you got to this point, maybe you skipped them all. Who knows? But my hope is that you'll look at the notes that I made and look at the kind of notes that you make and go, right, should I be making more notes? Can I make more notes? How is it possible to add more note taking in? You might look at my notes and go, these are rubbish. There is no depth, or these notes just aren't covered enough, which is great. What I would like is if you add questions or you add feedback in here, possibly sharing your own examples of how you test, writing blog posts about how you test, putting the links in here. That would be great, because what the world needs are more examples of how people test and why they test that way, what drove them to test in that way, what made them take notes in that form. Right? The more that we analyze our own approaches, the more we can explain the benefits of doing that, and the more we take ownership of our own test approach. Because I am absolutely convinced every single person has a unique approach to testing, and if we do not learn to harness that, we are not taking full advantage of our skill sets and abilities. So my aim for putting all this together is to help me get better, to try and make distinctions in my thought processes for how I test, but to not get hung up on them. I'm not going to get hung up on the notion that I have to plan, then do recon, then debrief. My language will change over time, right? My approach to testing will change over time. What I think is unlikely to change over time is my focus on making sure I know what I'm doing in advance, planning, doing stuff and capturing evidence in small chunks, whatever that session is, looking at what I've just done to reflect on it, to figure out what I'm going to do next and what I've learned and what my modeling is, right? Debrief. Then communicating to other people, fitting in with the project, the admin stuff. Those things are unlikely to change. So I think this is a relatively good generic model, but don't get hung up on it. Don't think you need to do these sessions. Don't think they need to be the same length that I did. You need to model your own processes, and I'm suggesting doing it this way, like not the actual sessions, but thinking it through in a session time in order to help you better understand what you do. The more you approach your work in small chunks, the more you can look at, why have I chosen to do this now? What is this that I'm doing? If it's small enough, you can probably give it a name. Otherwise, it just becomes testing. And testing is a good word, but it's so generic that it really doesn't explain what we do. And it's really hard to convince people that we're adding value when we just say, I'm doing testing. But if you say I'm doing a health check, then I'm debriefing to see what I need to do next. I'm just doing some recon so that I understand what it is I'm going to test. I'm just modeling the system so I can understand what coverage I'm going to achieve. I'm just doing a coverage. All of these things help us explain a bit better, and hopefully when you do your modeling, you'll come out with a completely different set of words that are unique to you, that may add more value to the external world than anything like this does. So thanks very much for spending the time going through it. I found this a useful exercise putting together. I hope there was something useful in there for you. Do leave comments and ask questions, and thanks very much.